Hello, listener, and welcome back to the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Logcast, as we delve deeper into the secret diary of Laura Palmer. This is the second part of a podcast analysis into the aforementioned book, and so, if you have not seen part 1 yet, I would strongly advise you check it out first. In any case, a content warning reminder is in order. If you are not in a comfortable headspace for topics such as abuse of children, including sexual abuse, drug use, addiction, trauma, and or mental health, then it would be advised to skip this episode or set it aside for another time. Without further ado, find a comfortable branch and enjoy the show.
I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
A little bit on Josie, if we can just jump right into Josie next.
Yeah.
Another female sexual encounter for Laura. This is, I don't even know how to judge support of her healthy anymore with Laura's context.
No.
This is one that has pretty much innately negative effects.
Yeah. No,
this one seems to have no even temporary positives.
And when it's like, again, around the time of the release and just the suggestion towards Josie, I can imagine that would be an interesting way for a viewer to continue going into season 2.
If you had read this before season 2, that'd be so weird.
Just being like, yeah, Josie, I feel sorry for Truman.
Yeah, Josie hires Laura basically by being at the Double R Diner, mentioning she's having trouble with English.
Yep.
And Laura in front of Norma's like, I'll help you out.
Yeah.
And in part, she kind of thinks of these different activities as a way to help her stay sober. She's thinking of, okay, if I do Meals on Wheels and I go with Josie and I go with Johnny, I'm eventually not going to have enough time. I'm going to get distracted. Like, she's using all these different things to soak up her time to stay sober.
Yeah.
She's really trying to get away from those drugs.
Yeah.
Eventually, she slips back into it. But there's a moment where she's trying, and it's in that moment where she's trying to sober up that she goes for Josie's offer here, or offers it to Josie, I should say.
Yeah.
But Laura notices that not only is Josie not really making any improvements, she doesn't seem to be trying. Josie's not really putting any effort into the actual tutoring.
I think that it's a front. Let's just face it. We know more about Josie with Andrew Packard. And if Packard needed her to learn a language, she probably has better knowledge than what she puts on.
It wouldn't be the first or last time that Josie has pretended to know less than she does.
Yeah, and in truth, this is just a front, an excuse to put forward. Say, for example, if something catches up to her.
Oh, me, I couldn't have killed anyone. I'm the innocent foreign lady. I don't even know how to speak English.
I don't know how to speak English. I was around this point with Laura Palmer. No, it is... Oof.
Did the portrayal of her in this book mesh with your idea of her in the show?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that it did it effectively enough and keeps things secret enough for people to speculate if they continue on in the show, but also pays credence to the similar Josie that we've seen throughout season 2.
And I think if you'd read this book, I think it would be the first time you would know, if you hadn't got through season 2 yet, that Josie was a sex worker in Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of knowing that element of Josie's past that I don't think you necessarily would have known by season 1's ending.
Mm-hmm.
Again, paints her in a certain light. It doesn't scream Josie shot Cooper.
No, it does not.
But it does give you intonations, again, as Laura writes, poor Sheriff Truman.
She is not what she seems.
Yeah. The encounter itself is described very strangely. It's the sense that it's almost what happens with Blackie 2 later, where this older woman seems that she can be in control, but by this point, Laura, through all of her different encounters, knows what she's doing enough that she takes the dominant position in this. Mm-hmm. And it's described less as something affectionate or something that's going to make Laura happy. It's described as conquest. Mm-hmm. And it's the sense that when she's done, when she leaves Josie, there's this feeling that it's yet another person in town she's lost respect for. Mm-hmm. And it's just, again, nothing positive comes from this, even in the most temporary sense. Mm-hmm. It's become less an act of distraction and peace for her and more of a conquest and a domination. It's very gross.
Yep.
It's very gross. And, again, portraying Josie in a different light, too. I think another danger, potentially, with the diary, which I don't think it does, but I could see an objection raised, is that your characters who are bisexual are not being portrayed in a very good light.
Nope.
You have Ronette and Laura, who... Ronette, I guess, is the most sympathetic because you can view her as pretty much just a victim straight through, but she's still engaged in activities that are highly suspect, highly questionable. But again, she's probably a minor. You could argue how much she really knows what she's doing. Laura's got Bob working against her to control a lot of what she's doing and influence her.
Yeah.
And then you have Josie, who's portrayed as kind of that trope of the bisexual predator or the lesbian predator. So I think it is quite unfortunate that the portrayals of bisexuality in the series, because there's nothing like that other than you could argue maybe coding, but nothing explicitly gay or bisexual in the actual show.
Yeah.
You could argue that for transgender characters, you have Denise Bryson.
Yeah.
But in terms of sexual orientation, it does play a little bit into that element that the characters who are bisexual are from seedier, shadier backgrounds.
It seems that it does use the elements of sex and elements of same sex in a light that doesn't have much light.
Again, I don't read it as negative. I don't read it as purposefully trying to harm or malign any group.
Yeah.
But I do think it's unfortunate that there's no counterexample.
Yes.
I don't know if it needed to have one. I don't know if it needed to mention, by the way, Dr. Hayward's bisexual and cool.
It didn't
need to do that.
It's definitely a product of its time, and I don't know how much of that may have gone past any sort of like emphasis on the studio, if you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Where they might see that representation as taking away viewers. And that's really sad. It really is sad for the product of its time.
And I think the book, for how much it went into things, I think the book could have gotten away with having a counterexample or a more positive portrayal.
I don't know if I can, because there's no real like good examples in this book other than in the bias of Laura Palmer's eyes.
Yeah, that's again where I think it's an arguable point of an arguable criticism you could make.
Yeah.
And it's one that of all the criticisms I've levied so far, that's probably the one I sympathize the most with. I do think it's very unfortunate that accidentally, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt, accidentally it plays into tropes and ideas that are more harmful.
Yes.
Before we leave Josie entirely, there's one more thing I want to bring up with her.
I mean, everyone else left Josie at the drawer pull, so
So I believe my first encounter with anything regarding the Diary of Laura Palmer outside of like the show Twin Peaks was there's this song by this group called Shoo Shoo.
Yeah.
And Shoo Shoo did this album called Shoo Shoo Plays the Music of Twin Peaks. And would you believe it's a cover album of Twin Peaks songs?
No, I thought by the title alone, this was something that handled, everything else.
Uh-huh. So the last track on the album is a bit weird. So everything else is a cover of a song from the original show or Fire Walk With Me. The last song is just ominously called Josie's Past. And the reason I bring up this song is because, weirdly enough, the band had decided to use in the 7-minute Josie's Past song about 4.5 minutes of someone narrating from the Diary of Laura Palmer.
Okay.
And in particular, it's the December 14th, 1986 diary entry. It's paired up then with the main vocalist of the band doing this rendition of the Mairzy Doats song that Leland Palmer so famously has enunciated upon us. Mm-hmm. And it's always struck me as an interesting note to end the album on, which, by the way, I'd recommend if you're interested in variations on Twin Peaks music. It's more of a drone, noisy, heavier side of the music, but I like that interpretation. And if that sounds like up your alley, check it out. You can find it on YouTube pretty accessibly. But the ending song, Josie's Past, I always found it strange that it's called Josie's Past when it clearly, lyrically and vocally, does not harken back to Josie specifically. It's Laura's diary. And it got me thinking whether or not there's something to the idea that we could talk about Josie and Laura being somehow connected or almost a shadow reflection of each other. Do you think that there is a sense in which Laura and Josie overlap? What ways are they similar? What ways are they different?
I don't know enough about Josie, I think, to get into full detail, and maybe that's just a crime by what happened. Mm-hmm. But from what I can tell,
right,
is that she is someone who is following in the shoes of people in power, that she is obeying their whims, and she does use sex as an active piece of her arsenal, if need be. And with that, there's also the note that Laura Palmer has a sense of control with things like sexual acts. Meanwhile, there are people in like darker senses in higher power that definitely speak over her, that being most prominently Bob.
Mm-hmm. One thing to clarify, too, is that the song and that album in general came out prior to the return. So there's no extra amount of knowledge that they would have about Josie, really, that you don't. They're not coming in with like a bunch of extra context.
Yeah.
So when they made that choice to conflate the past of Laura with the past of Josie, it is off of what we know. I also think it's interesting then to think about the sense in which Josie, we've talked before, she simultaneously is a victim of the powerful men around her and using her as a pawn, but also she is someone who is a victimizer at times, that she's someone who, like you said, uses sex as one of the items in her repertoire, but just in general is moving along positions and almost, if we take the show's word for it, believing what she needed to believe to survive at any given moment.
Yes.
Sort of oscillating between victim and victimizer, between someone to pity and someone you should pity her victims.
I think that having someone like Joan in Twin Peaks is important to see what someone who might be fully on Eckert's side would behave. Like,
right.
Who's to say Josie didn't do exactly the same thing Jones did in the attempts on Truman?
Well, and knowing that Josie has been implicated in the attempts on Andrew Packard's life in the past would tell you that she is capable of doing very similar things.
Yeah, I gotta say, though, Jones' method was a little bit more subtle than exploding boat.
It's exploding bank, but with a few extra steps added in. Or do you mean the wire in the throat?
I meant the wire in the throat with Truman because the bank thing was towards Packard.
Right.
Which, by the way, it's kind of hilarious looking back on that he evaded one explosion to walk straight into another one.
There's a grand irony to that element of Andrew's character that I can appreciate, to be honest. There's a poetic justice to it.
Except no justice and poetry is with quotations.
I mean, Pete's a poet. There's a poet there. Speaking of men who have their way with words, I don't know if this is an accurate descriptor, but Harold Smith is featured prominently in some parts of the diary. One thing that was circulating through my brain quite a bit as I was listening to this early on was reminding myself that Harold Smith presumably knows everything in this diary, that he has access to it and openly reads from it. And so we have the impression that everything we know about Laura Palmer from the diary, Harold knows, plus any additional things that he might have encountered with her before or after those diary entries are written.
Likely.
So how does this diary change your perceptions at all on Harold Smith as a character and his relatively short runtime in the series?
It definitely impacts him with the content of this and him being so tied to it. I almost would imagine that Harold, since he can't go out to the outside world, that he is away from such interactions and conflicts with other people, and that this is a very pure struggle. It's that same thrill one would get with any other book that they might find very endearing and attached to, like some would for romance novels that they would be attached to, of these fantastical things that they cannot experience themselves. I think that there is a thrill from that, despite some of the more very, very painful things. Not to mention, there's also the extra, I would say, enticing aspect that this, as far as Laura Palmer's perception goes, is true. Or however much she can convince Harold it is true.
Right. We do get a little bit of context on his backstory. I wouldn't say it's that much more than the series provides, but I think it's the flavoring and the descriptions of it that are of note. We find out that apparently he had been a botanist prior, but that some sort of event happened where he basically just woke up and he was out of nowhere agoraphobic in a way that he hadn't been prior. There seems to be some element of memory loss, some element of a new fear, a new phobia has entered his life. And we see the botanist elements carry through in the way he cares for the plants. But whereas before it seems like he had a professional life, he can't have that anymore now that he's trapped inside.
Yeah.
And part of the way that's worded is that it says he believes death is waiting just outside his door, calling him like a strange bird. And you've speculated before the elements with Harold that you're not so sure his death at the end was suicide, that there might have been some sort of involvement spiritually. It seemed like you were hinting at before.
Yeah.
And now that we have a mention of a strange bird being compared to death, there is a certain strange bird in Twin Peaks. They have a cave. If you rearrange the letters, it spells love. Do you happen to know what bird I'm talking about?
Oh, clearly it's elov because you don't know how to spell. No, yeah, owl. No, I am still very adamant on it, whether or not like the presence of the outside world or what had happened were so traumatic to him. Perhaps we could say that whatever is out there, that fresh pine air itself, could trigger something, if not Bob, something akin to Bob, that may behave maliciously for him for whatever is held in his past. That much we don't really know about, and that makes Harold a little more the enticing character. What also makes him enticing is that Laura Palmer decides to leave the diary behind with him.
Yeah.
Like, she chose this guy, which says a lot for the person who I would say is pretty distant from absolutely everybody.
Why do you think she chose him?
I'm not sure. I'm still kind of picking at that. You could say that just because it associates with some of his interests and she spent enough time with him, it might have just been putting a puzzle piece where she thinks that it belonged. It might have been a sense that there might be something she sees similar in Harold. If my previous statement is true, that there is a parasitic force that might behave against him, maybe she sees a bit of herself in him. It's definitely one of the weirder parts of the book.
My mind is still going to the more practical side that she's giving the diary to someone who never leaves his house. That it's someone who is always going to be around guarding, essentially, the diary, even if not that's his intent. He's always going to be in the vicinity of this diary. Barely anyone talks to him. He's as reclusive as you can get. So while he's definitely not a strong man or a dangerous man, who in the world's going to bug Harold and get it from him? Well, we found out it's Donna, but to Laura's mind, there's no one that could possibly take it from him.
I mean, there's that, but at the same time, like, Laura did have an instance in which someone seemed to look through her diary beforehand, and that was very impactful, and she became furious. But with the methods that she currently has, hiding the diary all the way up to this point, why she hasn't just been keeping the journal at Harold's from that point on. Maybe it's an accessibility thing, and she really did have that anxiety or just larger uncertainty that she would not arrive back. But I'm wondering if there was really any other locations, especially out of people's hands. I mean, yeah, she may have been more open with Harold, but at the same time, you're putting it in the hand of someone who's very curious about past and will constantly be opening and looking through that diary, likely.
It is also strange to consider, too, that her relationship with Harold, at least as the diary describes it, it's one of the more alarming in context of Bob within Laura.
Yes.
That at first, she's sharing her stories, and she knows that what she's saying about sexuality, especially the One-Eyed Jack stories, she knows, in her words, that it stimulates him. But she also notices how almost violently he reacts whenever she makes advances. So, like most of Laura's relationships by this point, she does make sexual moves on him, and he clearly is not wanting that. He is rejecting that.
Yeah.
Worse than the fact that she continues seemed to me her motivation behind it, is that when she notices Harold is afraid, she is aroused. And she even compares it into the diary how she thinks Bob must feel when he sees Laura scared.
Yeah.
So she is aware that she is doing to Harold a form of what Bob has done to her. And she describes it as a prey being cornered and degrading and made a toy. And to be honest, if I were to articulate one thing that Laura does in this diary that is like her biggest sin, her biggest wrongdoing, I would say it's what she does to Harold. If I were to point to the biggest thing that I have a hard time forgiving Laura for, I know Jacoby will forgive her for it. I don't know if I can. Again, to avoid using words that could get this podcast episode taken down, the R word, right? She does that to Harold.
Yes.
And that sort of assault to someone who cannot escape, I have a hard time reconciling that with any sense of redemption.
I think that this is a point inside of the diary in which she is certainly very far gone by her own abilities and so on. She's very much grown into almost a Leland-like state, sadly. And that is very it says a lot about what Bob's nature is, but at the same time, I couldn't even tell you what my finger pointing at it would even be.
And the fact that this is the person she gives the diary to. It almost makes me wonder, is she trying to do some form of repentance in the idea of, I owe the guy, here's the diary?
And not to mention, we have to consider, like, with Harold still, from what it seems, maybe looks fondly back on it, maybe, looks fondly, maybe even at the pain, but he certainly does hold the diary in high enough regard that he still wants to keep it around.
Yeah, I think the hard part about Harold is that he's in such a vulnerable position where Laura is the most exciting thing in his life while she's visiting.
Yeah.
Those moments where she visits each week, I gotta imagine he's waiting on bated breath because he's alone. You know, prior to Donna coming to visit, prior to Laura coming to visit before then, we don't have any indication that Harold is visited by people. There's this sense that aside from Meals on Wheels, he isn't around anyone.
Which, by the way,
even though he's afraid of the outside world, he desperately craves that human interaction.
I'm kind of curious on, like, generally how Harold even got food prior to Meals on Wheels.
Yeah, I remember you speculating Meals on Wheels back when we had that episode.
Oh, yeah, no, but apparently, if I'm not mistaken from the text, like, Meals on Wheels was a collaboration with
Laura
Norma
came up with
Laura.
it. Laura basically proposed the idea.
Yeah, so it very much makes me concerned for the livelihood of Harold.
Maybe the Tremont boy, ran to the grocery store for him occasionally.
And gave him, like, cream corn in his hands and just, here
or,
you go.
He pulled gold coins out of people's ears, like he did with Laura in the diary, and then he paid for the services at the grocery store with the gold coin.
Yeah, I don't know how the services even work with Twin Peaks. I just generally don't know the situations that would be available.
I have this mixed feeling where I simultaneously want to know more, and I simultaneously don't want to know anything. I'm really torn because part of me wants to know the ins and outs. Yeah, how did Harold get food? But then I'm also like, I don't need to know that. I don't even know if I want to know that. That could just be a mystery. Harold's existence is one of the more mystical elements that...
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking to myself, like, as a power play with the owls waiting for him outside, they hunt prey, leave it at the door as a means of, like, we'll let you live, but as a reminder, you know who's watching.
Hate it when I find owl pellets in the cream corn. But
no.
but no, I think there's a lot of speculation you could do with Harold at this point. You could speculate he might not even be of this world. I mean, you could try to make a case because the Tremonts, right? The Tremonts, the older lady, the grandmother, and the grandson, right? They definitely seem to be off in some regard. Are they spiritually inclined the way the log lady is, or are they actually spirits the way that the milkman is?
You know the difference? You want to know the difference?
What?
One is a place in which someone else lives entirely, and the address got mixed up, and no one's really had a missing persons case brought up.
Yep.
Meanwhile, we did investigate Harold's body. It seems he physically had a body.
So you would be more on the side that Harold... normal in the sense that he's real, right? Tangible, actual human person with a date of birth and a birth certificate, presumably. And Mrs. Tremont, grandson, being of a nature that may not have a birth certificate in our known world.
Or possibly a past birth certificate. I don't know how time necessarily works, especially with the spirits. If
they could be ghosts.
If Laura Palmer is indicative of someone who is now in the Black Lodge and is a present resident, that could be said about the other residents as well.
Again, if it even is the Black Lodge where Laura is. It's described as the waiting room.
The Red Room, the Waiting Room, the Black Lodge.
We got to be careful when we say it's the Black Lodge, we got to be careful. Is there proof?
Okay, hear me out here. But if I'm in the parking lot of Walmart and you ask me where I'm at, I'll say I'm at Walmart.
Yeah, for shorthand, but you're not actually at Walmart yet.
And hence the shorthand.
So you think of it as being at the front door of the Black Lodge.
Being at the front door of the lodges, maybe the Black Lodge, we don't really know much about the Black Lodge. All I know is that the waiting room was right next to it.
To give you another contrary, terrible analogy, if you were standing in front of a pool versus being inside of the water in the pool...
If you texted me, I'm saying, hey man, I'm at the pool.
You're at the pool, not in the pool. And my point is that the Black Lodge might be something a little bit more elevated than just simply a parking lot.
That's why I'm going to say at the lodge, not in the lodge.
Fair enough.
There we go. We have agreed. There has been now a piece of paper that has written in contract in blood for the sake of unity, whatever that is called.
No, we've confirmed that you're a bleeder.
An agreement.
Just because we've confirmed that you're a bleeder in a past episode doesn't mean that we have to sign things in blood, Professor.
I need to keep this up consistently to make sure I do have blood for myself.
Well, anyway, speaking of people with blood, the log lady.
Does she?
Yes.
Do you think that she has blood and not sap?
I believe that she has blood, her log has sap. Clearly, get with the program. We get one notable encounter with the Log Lady, and I think it's the right amount of Log Lady. I'm glad that she's here, but I don't think we need to have a ton of her in this book.
Yeah.
I think that she's the right amount. It's still strange to think that if we hadn't had the Log Lady intros, if we would have just watched this on like Netflix, the Log Lady would be in the show so much less.
Yeah.
Because those intros are where we saw her.
Yeah.
If she wasn't in those intros, you would see her once every like 8 episodes, maybe. Just kind of for little bursts here and there.
She has enough of a presence and a simple enough of a moniker.
She's there less than Jacoby, I'll put it that way. That's how little she would be in there.
I would almost argue that though Jacoby does more, I think I get more of an impact from the Log Lady because...
Fair enough. She's iconic for the series, so you are definitely not alone in that feeling. Mm-hmm. And clearly the Log Lady left an impression on Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
And there's this moment where Laura has one of her many dreams, and this one, she doesn't really remember all the details, but she just remembers there being an address. And she feels compelled to go to this address.
Mm-hmm.
As she's going there, she finds an abandoned gas station. And the Log Lady's there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at this moment when she sees the Log Lady, she's like, oh yeah, the Log Lady was in that dream too. And the Log Lady reveals that she'd also had this dream, and you were there, and you were there. So, first off, we have a gas station as the location.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like the Log Lady claims credit for giving Laura the dream. It seems like they both experienced the dream together, but neither of them initiated this weird telepathy dream connection.
Yeah.
Which, as far as we know, the only ones that Laura had that dream connection with otherwise are her mom and Maddie. So to have the Log Lady in there is kind of interesting. It's not a blood relative in any regard. So what do you think of, one, it being a gas station, an abandoned gas station of all places? And then two, what do you think of the Log Lady having that connection with Laura like that to the dream?
I don't know about the gas station on how substantive it is. Sure, you could say that with that abandoned gas station, it definitely sets a mood, if you will, something that would be likely present and very well visited, now left to be its own hollow remains in which there is nothing for it. There's nothing inside of it. No sweetness of the candies, no assistance for the energy. It is just a hollow presence.
So you're thinking more of the convenience store inside of the gas station itself.
I'm thinking about the sum of its parts, not just the convenience store, but also the gasoline. I don't imagine that the abandoned gas station will have any accessible pumps that even one could give. It just is what I would say a remnant of a past use.
And if we want to think about it more symbolically, gasoline being something that causes fuel, it causes a spark, it causes a fire.
Well,
right?
it causes like something that could be sparked into a fire.
Right.
If you had gasoline that's only like had a spark, I promise you there will be fire.
Again, what I'm saying is that it is used for the purpose often of combustion, of fire, of energy.
Okay.
And the idea of an abandoned gas station, it is a place that formerly supplied that source for fire, source for energy.
It supplied fuel for a fire.
And so the question is, fire has an almost universally negative connotation in Laura's life and in Twin Peaks. It's consistent. And then the Log Lady's life, we find out some things about her with fire that aren't so hot.
Yep.
It was a joke.
Yeah, anyway, how do you feel about yourself?
I feel terrible. Rip. But anyway, knowing that the Log Lady and Laura both have these negative connotations with fire, that's a questionable thing, but also is the abandoned nature of it good because it's no longer giving the fire source? Or do we think it not of fire, we think of it as fuel, we think of it as energy? And the Log Lady, by giving her words to Laura, by reassuring Laura, she is giving Laura fuel. She is giving Laura kind of a little pick-me-up.
I don't know. I think that even with an abandoned area, I don't think that's necessarily fully dry. If anything, like this empty place, there's only so much that can be done with it. Like, I don't know if you can necessarily drip it out, and I don't know how much, like, the remnants of gasoline will stick, but hey, throw a match around there, and I'm sure you will get a decent enough fire. I think that it is certainly reflective on the nature of Laura Palmer eventually. I think that you could even say that there is a little bit of the Log Lady present with something of that metaphorically.
Yeah, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to talk about fire like this, because in the same conversation, the Log Lady talks about her husband being a firefighter.
Yeah.
Was this new information for you?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure if the show ever said it, so I avoided talking about it.
Either that or it went over my head, but
so,
yeah.
The Log Lady's husband, if we go by the diary, was a firefighter. and he died with his face in the fire. And it was shortly after the log lady's husband died that she got her log. And she also talked about how her fireplace is sealed up. You can start to notice between the log lady intros, what we know of the series, and now what we know of the diary, you can start to form a picture of the events that happened in the log lady's, again, history with fire.
Yeah.
That her husband was someone who literally fought against fire to put out fires. And now the best she could do is board up her fireplace and hold her log tightly. You could even possibly interpret the log as being something spiritual, right? Because, on first blush, she could just be a crazy lady who thinks she's talking to a log. But given the nature of Twin Peaks, given the fact that the log lady lives in the middle of the woods, and given that she got this log shortly after her husband passed away, there's a lot of spiritual things going on here that log might actually be talking to her.
If you think of between an opposite from a light to darkness or anything like that perspective, honestly, fire is probably the furthest thing from something like wood. With this nature, if fire were to overcome, then there would just be so much fire just quickly running across the rampant lands. Meanwhile, if you go for this earth or woody tone, if there is enough to stomp out a small little flame, it will go out. Now, mind you, I think that fire is the more destructive force and something that can be more overcoming at times. And I think that her attaching herself to the log and her boarding off the fireplace could have been something in which all fire is just very painful for the log lady. Now, mind you, it also makes me wonder, there's also other things you can put forward as opposites towards fire.
Right.
Hey, what if the log lady had just a very large water bottle that she carried around instead? But no, I think that the wood speaking to people is just more of a spiritual tone.
Yeah, that was my next natural question, and it's a little off topic, but I'm confident this podcast episode is not going to be too long, so I think it's fine. So, Professor, I'm just going to confirm right now, do you believe the log actually talks to the log lady?
I'm going to answer this in twofold. Do I think that the log has something of a spirit, a presence, maybe even one might even ask a soul? Well, when you have things such as the White and Black Lodge, potentially. I mean, I think it's very important that when Major Briggs thinks he's in the White Lodge, which that visual is anything to go off of, it's very different from the reflective room beyond the waiting room, unless that's just prevalent in one's mind and what they must face. I would say almost direct opposites. One is established, the other one is very wild. Which is also funny because they're wild but at the same time peaceful in opposite ends too. Ooh, there are some layers if we are to interpret the White and Black Lodge that way. But the most noble thing is that it's a very nature-esque place. It is very pure in that own respect. And who knows, maybe the spirits of the White Lodge might be indicative of what the log would be, something more nature, something more absolutely pure.
So yes?
That's one thing. Second thing is that I have to ask, does Twin Peaks have that sort of thing in which it speaks to us? Something that is in our own form, something that is not truly there. It is simply a reel of film that goes on before us and what it could impact us with. Do you have a favorite item, Kalil, in which it's something that really does speak to you and just inspires you, is your muse? It's a wonder if it is something that is more vacant and spiritual that sort of inspires her or makes her think these thoughts, or if it is in a realm that, yes, it is like the spiritual and strange mystical nature Twin Peaks just generally is.
I think of it almost in the context of if there's an old-fashioned TV that has bunny ears, and it's the antennae, the antenna, plural, that is used to get the connection, right? I almost think of the log, and this is my own interpretation, right, is that the log is receiving the signal, and it's transmitting it to the log lady. I don't think of the log as having sentience. I don't think the log itself is a thinking wood, but I do think it's a conductor of sorts that allows the spiritual energies to reach the log lady.
Okay.
And therefore the voices speak through the log, not that the log is talking.
Is it funny that when I hear you say that the log you do not believe has sentience, I just imagine Wyndham World coming around the corner, log lady outfit, and decking you with a log?
I think your thoughts of violence toward me are indicative of a bigger problem, to be honest.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sure this the cause like everything will be okay.
Speaking of big problems, the log lady warns that sometimes the woods are good for us.
Yeah.
Other times the woods, they're not really for us. They're for other creatures. And sometimes people learn things on camping trips that they shouldn't learn. And children can become prey sometimes. Oh, and also owls are sometimes big. So just some vague, ominous warnings.
Yeah.
Again, this would have been released before season 2, so we wouldn't have known the context of how much owls were going to be a thing.
Yeah.
But this ominous message of, just kind of be careful about the woods, which Laura proceeds then to not be extremely careful about the woods. She, in fact, goes in there quite often.
Yep.
I honestly, the more I think about it, one of the people I don't blame for Laura's death would be the log lady.
Okay.
If there's someone I don't think has guilt or blood on her hands, it's the log lady, because I think that she did what she could in her context. I don't think the log lady is the type of person who can just go out of her way and constantly talk to Laura and follow up with her. I think the log lady's there to give this sort of message, give this warning, as I think her log and her dream guided her to do so, and she did what she could. I almost feel that the log lady is one of the people who, I think she tried.
I think that she ended up being more of a presence on stage for this tragedy, more than she was impactful for the character.
So the only other thing that the log lady really does in this counter, other than, again, give backstory on the firefighter husband, as well as the warning about the woods, she does kind of reassure Laura about Laura being beautiful, that many people will grow to love Laura.
Yeah.
And sort of that, again, a little bit of boost and encouragement that the log lady warns her about the dangers, but also notices that maybe either consciously or unconsciously notices that Laura needs reassurance in a positive way as well. Mm-hmm. Laura doesn't need someone to yell at her and yell at her and yell at her. She needs to be reassured because this is a moment in her life where she's full of anxiety. Mm-hmm. And separating for a moment a lot of the spiritual, supernatural elements of Laura's life and looking at it as a girl going through puberty, constantly ashamed of her body, ashamed of her actions, not having people around, especially older women, not having older women around to talk to her about those things and to reassure her and to talk positively about being a woman. The log lady fills a little bit of a void there.
And as Jupiter and Saturn align, let us bring you into our lodgings as we interview our friend Rue and the insights beyond our own.
Hello, as we mentioned earlier, we have a special guest interview for this episode of the podcast. With us today is our friend Rue. Rue, could you please introduce yourself? Who are you? What are you?
So, hi, I'm Rue. I am basically I don't know if Jane Doe, I'm not sure if people would say I'm your average person, but once upon a time, I was a teenage girl. So that's why I'm here.
That instantly makes you more qualified to talk about this book than either of us. Congratulations. But one notable difference is that you have not gone through all of Twin Peaks. So what has been your background with Twin Peaks as a series prior to reading this book?
That's a really long story, and it did not turn out well. But I would say that I watched Twin Peaks with an ex who shall not be named. And I ended up, I don't remember which episode we ended on, but one thing that really bothered me was that I could not recognize most people throughout the TV series due to my unfortunate inability to recognize faces. I just I recall that everyone was having relations with each other. And that's the main, there were dreams involved. It was very mysterious. Ooh, surreal, And everyone was being each other. That's it. So that's about as much as I remember.
I mean, it definitely has that soap opera element in general, and there is a lot of fun times with that. I would say that since we are in the more book format, were there any sort of names that sort of popped out that you found familiar then?
Laura, quite obviously, I suppose. I don't remember Bob, which concerned me because I feel like he probably would be a character in Twin Peaks. Correct me if I'm actually completely wrong.
Bob is absolutely a character in Twin Peaks, yes.
Yes, wow. This is pretty bad. Yeah, I had some trouble focusing on it then. So
it depends on how far you got into it, though, is how much you'd be aware of Bob.
Yep.
Oh, really? That might be it then. Because I definitely didn't finish it, but I don't remember at which point I was in grad school at the time, you know. Let me think if I remember anyone else. The therapist, yes.
Dr. Jacoby?
Yes, I remembered the therapist, I think.
Okay. What about the therapist do you remember? Now you got me curious. He's a very memorable man.
He was pretty sketchy.
Yeah.
It's been 2 years and a lot has happened in 2020. So my memories of the time I watched Twin Peaks is quite blurry.
It's fine. 2020 was impactful enough on me that sometimes I have a hard time remembering Twin Peaks. And we've been doing the podcast for about a year.
So you kind of went into the diary semi-blind. I mean, blind enough that you remembered like 3 characters and that was about it, right?
Yes, I would say this is very accurate.
So what were your general thoughts on The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer? That we just kind of like shoved your way. You did the audiobook. We're like, here you go, throwing you in blind. What did you think of it?
I do not like the audiobook formats. I do think that the fact that Bob was voiced by Jennifer Lynch was kind of hilarious. So that would be my main complaint, actually. I enjoyed the book otherwise. I was confused in a very good way, which described like what I watched of Twin Peaks, if I remember. Like,
Now I want to check. Now I want to check in with a few things on that. For one, I wanted to check in. Do you just not like general audiobook formats in general, or is it just more so it wasn't as fitting for you for this?
Both, I think. Yeah, both.
All right. And I also heard that you said that it was Jennifer Lynch voicing Bob. Actually, believe it or not, Laura Palmer's actress was the one who ended up reading The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Okay.
And you just insulted her acting abilities. Slanderer. This podcast stands Cheryl Lee. Do we still that phrase stan? Is that still a thing?
Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, Cheryl Lee was actually the one who ended up reprising the role as Laura Palmer, reading off Laura Palmer's diary. And I do find it fascinating with that sort of perspective. I myself do enjoy a good audiobook, especially if you get someone who really can get into the role. As far as Twin Peaks, I think that I don't know how else one would read a diary other than by the character. So if you could have the diary redone in the most ideal way, how would you want this diary to be read off?
Redone in the most ideal way. I'm not entirely sure because I do think I would want another character. Well, it would be hard to even decide who I would want to play Bob because he's just this sort of ghostly demonic presence, right? Like it's quite clear that to me it's meant to be like genderless, almost self-referential.
There was an actor who played Bob named Frank Silva. Unfortunately, he passed away before this audiobook was made. So your ideal form, though, it sounds like, would bring back the actor who played Bob in the show, correct?
Ideally, this Frank guy would basically possess Cheryl, and that's how I would have enjoyed it.
Or would you have preferred, like, you mentioned kind of the genderless aspect. Do you think that having the sort of male actor with Laura's voice as the rest of the diary, would that feel jarring, or would you have liked that?
I think since they're already pretty consistent in choosing the original actress, it would probably be best for the audience to listen to, Frank. But I would actually prefer some sort of strange genderless. I don't even know what that would sound like, so I don't know.
Interesting. So since you went in again pretty blind, do you have any questions after reading the diary about Twin Peaks, just for context to understand the book better?
Yes.
We are experts, so go ahead.
Professor's an expert. I don't claim to be.
The Unplugged Professor. What is going on here? Who's Bob?
Yes, there actually are reveals through the series that Bob is some sort of entity that ends up leeching off of individuals such as, in this case, Leland Palmer, Laura Palmer's father. So a lot of the events that occur with some of the more sketchy things Bob has done may also be connected to Leland Palmer.
Which was something I was going to ask is, when you read the book, did you get a sense of who killed Laura Palmer at the end?
I mean, I actually was dissociating quite a bit during my reading of this, or listening of it rather. So I am leaning a little bit. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not actually sure.
So you don't know the answer just because that's kind of like one of the big spoilers of Twin Peaks is who killed Laura Palmer. For like all of season 1 and a good half of season 2, it's the main question driving most of the narrative. So I wasn't sure if you had that spoiled or if you happened to know the answer to that prior to reading the book.
And to be completely serious on the matter, on entirely what Bob is, that is something that is very hard to pin down, and I would almost argue has a very subjective element to it.
I think it rejects singular definitions very effectively, in the sense that there's kind of a dual narrative going on where you can interpret Bob as a more classical demon archetype that does possess people, that it like enters through their minds or souls or hearts, whatever you want to have you, and it controls them momentarily and then just kind of sits in the background like most of the time. It like goes in hibernation mode, then kicks in and takes over. The show supports that idea quite a bit. The other alternative is that Bob is more just simply the evil that men do, which is what one of the characters, Albert, ends up saying about it, and that Bob's more of a manifestation of something people already do that's evil or sinister. It's just kind of a reflection of that.
Now, you're saying that there are dual interpretations here, Kalil, but don't you mean twin? Don't you mean twin
I think dual, twin, mirror, any sort of synonymous way you want to word that. But the main one who in the Twin Peaks series is the host of Bob, is Leland Palmer, the father, who in the series is the one who kills Laura Palmer.
I was going to guess that. It seemed pretty clear, to be honest. But it wasn't certain, so I wasn't sure if I could say.
So you felt like when you read the book, it was pretty clear by the end that Leland was the killer?
I mean, I had a strong feeling based on everything that with Bob, I think there's something that people do to disassociate the terrible things that the people they love do to them. And it's much easier to think of someone you care about, someone who is supposed to protect you and love you, to, as like being possessed, right? Of something that they don't mean to hurt you, that they don't want to hurt you the way they do. It's certainly not them hurting you, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that Bob, this recursive being, is instead the one blamed for everything that does happen.
Okay.
Were there any other questions for context on the show?
Oh, there's quite a bit. I guess, number one, how does Laura Palmer have the time for all of this?
She doesn't. Time doesn't exist.
She's magic. The answer's magic.
Yes.
To give a frank answer, a lot of Twin Peaks buy-in, if you will, is your ability to just suspend your disbelief about the nature of time. Because even with what we've seen in the original show and a bit with the movie, there seems to be a sort of distortion where things happen very strangely. Either it's A, really hard to tell how much time has passed between episodes, or B, the timelines don't even match up perfectly. Because like between the book and the show, there are discrepancies that would place events at different times. So you can call it a writing error consistent with the series, or you can call it kind of a purposeful decision that between the different writers of Twin Peaks and the book creates this sort of disorienting feeling of you're not really quite sure how time works. And I would argue that Laura is basically an extension of that, where realistically, no, she shouldn't have all that time. And the fact that people don't catch on to all these different things that she does is remarkable. I think knowing that Leland is what he is, and what we know of the mother, Sarah Palmer, as well from the series and the movie, it's possible that their ignorance is a little bit more either A, supernatural, or B, negligent.
I mean, there are hints towards things such as like drugs being involved with Sarah Palmer and likely Leland drugging her out for that condition.
So those two not knowing that she's going out at night kind of does make some sense in context.
Yeah. There's also the idea, not only with this sort of like little bit of broken home, I do hope that when it comes down to Laura Palmer's diary, you said yourself, time is weird in Twin Peaks. I really hope that the timeline is straight when it comes to like the secret diary of Laura Palmer. I hope everything's in order.
I am frightened by so I live my life based on cause and effect and prediction and trying to figure things out based on linear progression of time. So I'm sure it reads much more like poetry if I were to watch the series. While reading the book, though, it felt very much like a linear progression that was easy to follow.
I hope the audio of the professor pouring that coffee picks up on the microphone. Coffee's a recurring thing in Twin Peaks. I don't think the book translates that much, but anyway.
Basically, if there's not a clear world that I can model based on cause and effect and a lot of, hypothesizing, I suppose, it reads much more like poetry to me than something that, so the world in Full Metal Alchemist, I can go, oh, okay, so this makes sense because that, something like that. But they're like the Twin Peaks world. It's like when you are not of this temporal dimension, it's a lot harder to predict what will happen, etc., that kind of thing.
That's okay. That is interesting. So when you watched Twin Peaks originally, did you feel like it was a form of poetry like that? Or is that something that now you're just kind of thinking based on how we're talking about it?
I thought it was a form of poetry, but I wondered if that was my own fault for not being able to recognize. Yeah, I am terrible with faces. I think terrible is an understatement. I can barely recognize people. I can recognize Laura Palmer because she keeps popping up everywhere being the dead person, right? And that's about it.
Yeah, so I think obviously every group has their gatekeepers and people who have very rigid definitions, but as a whole, I think the Twin Peaks community, more than most fan communities of a show or narrative, leans on the side that there's probably not a wrong way to view Twin Peaks. If you view the show as kind of like a weird people soup, and it's all just poetic and free-flowing, I think that there's a value in that interpretation as much as there is someone who can map out every single event along some timeline and everything makes sense to their brain.
The first thing I think of whenever I see people soup is poetic.
Yeah. Little chunks of man flesh.
Why am I on this podcast?
So now that you're still stuck with us, were there any other, again, series questions about anything with Twin Peaks for context of the book?
After you said that, pretty much any interpretation would be considered more or less equally valid, which I'm not entirely sure if I agree with, but I do think it's more like, what if I said it's about chromium or butterflies? Is that valid?
I think if you have a little bit of evidence. I mean, we generally within the Twin Peaks community, they like some kind of evidence, but I think that your viewing of the show is more of a form of poetry. It would click with people. I think that's a way that you could interpret it that people would see as valid.
I like that. As long as it clicks, that means something to me.
And I will say this is a mild spoiler for the professor. There are elements of David Lynch's films that are often interpreted that way, which we're going to be doing the David Lynch films on the podcast next. So he's plugging his ears, but he'll probably listen to this audio later anyway.
I am going to la until I think it's done. There's going to be a weird chunk of audio that doesn't work.
Okay. It was a very mild spoiler. Do not worry.
But before we do continue, I just want to make one comment. Cut this out of the podcast.
Sure.
Isn't people soup just a hot tub?
You're right.
I'm not cutting this out of the podcast. This is great. Why would I cut that out?
I can't unhear it.
Put that on the Patreon-only exclusive format.
Oh, no.
The People Soup Edition. Okay, all right. I think we're going to move on now from the People Soup. So now that you've experienced it and you kind of have a little bit more context for the show, do you feel like the book works as a standalone book? I'm starting to think of a fancy word.
Does the book work as a book on its own?
I mean, that's my question, though. Would you recommend this if someone was like, hey, I want to read a book that deals with kind of the difficulties of a teen girl's life going off the edge or something? However you'd word that. Would you want to recommend this? Or you think, no, you need Twin Peaks as a series for context?
Oh, you do not need Twin Peaks for... I don't know if I would recommend that as for coming of age stories. Well, I guess that's not necessarily a girl's life going off. Well, it's definitely a standalone book. in the sense that I can enjoy it without knowing anything about Twin Peaks because I consider myself a complete novice.
So now I want to dive into some of the questions that we had previously talked about just a little bit over text communication. You had mentioned to me earlier that you found Laura, as you were reading the diary or listening to it, you found Laura to be a very relatable person, but also very different. Can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by that?
I think most people are relatable. This might be an element of me, but I think that anyone could heavily relate to, say, that shame she felt when she was younger and, well, throughout her life. Now that I think about it, she died before she was able to conquer that. That is very unfortunate. I found that the way she handled the suffering from shame and abuse was extremely different than mine. It was in a way that I could sort of understand. I could definitely empathize with, but I took an extremely different route, almost out of ego, as in, instead of putting on like when people try to project what they think of or what they think I am, etc., I try very quickly to dispel that illusion however I can. It feels like Laura gives in, like she just allows people to let her to see basically whatever they need her to be, right?
She becomes a mirror for others in a sense, yes.
Mm-hmm. And though there may not be like 100% like this is something that exactly happened to me, I think that the overall function of she does an action, and even if she may think it's virtuous in the moment, finding out the overall domino effect that she ends up suffering through can be a little bit of a nice reflection and release for someone who's reading it possibly for the first, second, or third time, being like, God, this is painful, and just kind of get that release out of it.
Well, you mentioned cause and effect earlier, Rue, and there's a bit of a weird almost trap that Laura enters into for a lot of the book where she'll do something that she believes is kind of a way of healing, and then later feel like that was the very thing that caused her to be unworthy or to be in some way dirty. And then that feeling of guilt will then cycle around, and she'll do something to make herself feel good about herself, and it just keeps looping around. So instead of having a normal cause and effect, it feels like a lot of this book is that cycle. I don't know if that relates to how you felt reading it.
I definitely agree with it's so unfortunate that that is the case too. I believe a lot of it is like some good psychotherapy can help everyone, but especially people undergoing such severe stress, you know. It definitely seemed like a cycle that I used to be in, well, maybe, okay, not this intense of a cycle. Well, not even close. But I did used to loop about negative thoughts of, pretty typical teenage thoughts, I suppose. Ones of like, pretty much everything that Laura mentioned of trying to discover the world and herself and dealing with the first person angle of what she thought of the world and the third person angle from how it's observed. It's just something that I think is pretty universal at the end of the day. So I don't think it really matters that much that I'm a teenage girl once, other than the fact that I experienced like several of the coming of age moments that you guys most likely did not. Most likely.
So just to clarify your comment there, you feel that a lot of the experiences in the book are not necessarily gender specific?
Definitely not. I do think it's likely, well, studies have shown that it's more likely women feel certain ways, like are at least more often diagnosed with, say, anxiety or something like that. However, that also has like serious, selectivity bias, selection bias. Sorry.
No, I think a lot of the thoughts you're offering are pretty compelling. You mentioned just a moment ago dissociation. What struck you about how the book handles dissociation and just on a more broad scale mental health?
Whew, that's a very broad question.
Yeah, take your time.
It did remind me of dissociative identity disorder, in which the painful parts, like usually people who were abused before the age of 6 in a very, traumatic fashion, well, end up potentially having dissociative symptoms and eventually having like alters. And I wondered, like, okay, so is Laura a girl who has suffered through childhood? Well, definitely a girl who has suffered through some sort of child abuse, right? And if it was before the age of 6, she could easily have gotten Bob as her alter, as essentially an evil Laura. Well, not necessarily her being evil, but just an evil presence that is like within her. It reminded me of several different, like, it could be a lot of things, schizophrenia, etc. I have quite a few unorthodox ideas on mental illness as someone who has been through the, program. And actually, yeah, both as someone who was treated for ADHD and as someone who is now officially done with her degree. So I have quite a few thoughts on that is difficult to get into right now, but I'm happy to talk about it more later on, actually, perhaps through writing or such, if people would like to read that. But for dissociation, it seemed like Laura had a lot of trouble with integration in general, which explains, I mean, she literally has the secret life. Like, for dissociation, you cut off elements of yourself, which is why, for me, integration is so important in everything I do. I think, is this going to help make things, is this going to basically integrate instead of divide? Like, because I think, in a world with no contradictions, that the only way to insight is essentially to like make all the different components and find the underlying whatever it is that makes it all make sense, right? And honestly, Twin Peaks as a series, Laura had a very, very little of this sense of integration. And I can sense, usually when that happens, you're left disoriented and turmoil. Like after abuse, which is from, the minds of the sad, sick minds, distorted minds of people who lash out because of their own suffering, their own sick thoughts, it's very easy to end up having to dissociate away a part of you to reduce cognitive dissonance. Like for me, when I was abused in the past, my go-to was essentially the freeze response, and also to not feel my feelings very strongly. Like I would be aware that I had feelings guiding me, but I couldn't say, it wasn't something loud. Like what ultimately made all my decisions was the part of my brain that wanted to make sure at the end of the day that I was doing something that would make sure everyone gets out alive, right? So it felt very much like if I sensed that there was always the potential for me to have like dealt with my trauma in other ways, some of the ways that you might have heard about, right? And some people distort reality to better fit to reduce cognitive dissonance. Some people just rationalize what they want. There are so many ways, and at the end of it is always that dissonance that guides it, right? And I think that's the reason behind so much of the dissonant parts of the book. I think it really does boil down to basically an inability to make sense of a world that just seemed so much like what you would expect to happen, what people expect and want from you, or to be betrayed by all those expectations, and also not want to betray anyone's expectations of you as perfect Laura Palmer, right? I think all that is definitely something that most people have at least felt for a little bit, maybe not to this extent.
Rue, I am so glad we got you on this podcast episode. That is a very, very valuable perspective. There's a lot to respond to in that. One thing that interested me when you were talking about the division element within Laura, there's a character who I don't I think shows up one time in the book, called the Log Lady, which I don't know if you had any questions about when you just saw the name the Log Lady in a book. But the log, or heard, I guess, audiobook. But the Log Lady is sort of a cryptic character, and she does intros for the episodes. The intros are made after the show finished airing and when it was being rerun. And one of the intros that she talks about, she's very late into the show. She talks about the idea of when we see one, there's always two or more, and kind of speculating like, when will there only be one? When there's only one, it'll be like peaceful, I think. I don't know the exact way she worded it. I don't know if Professor does either. But that kind of reminded me a lot of that too, that sense of unity and totality and integration, to use your word from that. How much of a healing that would be, and how much that sense of splitting and division can really cause internal chaos, but also possibly chaos for the outside. I was going to ask you kind of as a spin-off question to this, how many different Lauras do you think there are?
I mean, only Laura would know, right? There's the image of a perfect Laura that she presents. There's the Laura who is the bad girl. There's the Laura who is her emotional self, who is full of shame, who she only opens up to fully in her secret diary, not in her false diary, which I was very saddened to hear that she had a false diary. Like, I, in the past, due to fear of prying eyes, would, like occasionally like bomb my diary because no one's supposed to read it. And if someone did read it, I would know, and such. But like, it just felt just so sad that she would have to keep up this facade that you just know it's, number one, it's not healthy. It's nobody who cares about someone would want to do anything other than know the real them, right? To know the person they care about. Yeah. And I think that it's interesting that you mentioned the thing about when there will be peace when there's one or something, because I remember the Log Lady from watching the series. She was like one of the people who stood out. I mean, they all kind of stood out, I guess.
I mean, who stood out more, the log or the lady?
Honestly, the log was pretty cool. I kind of remember the log. But
nice
yeah, anyway. What?
Nice hunk of wood.
Yeah, I agree.
Rue, I think you've done a really good job kind of explaining some of the dissociation and internal issues within Laura Palmer and talking about those cycles of shame and abuse. And one of the, I would say, main elements that cause that cycle of shame and abuse is Laura's response to her burgeoning sexuality. Since we entered the secret diary right on the beginning of puberty, and that seems to be an overarching concern for her. So you also mentioned to me when you were listening to the audiobook, someone was nearby and they thought you were listening to erotica because of some of the more seedier elements, however you want to word that. So my question for you, it's a huge one, is what did you think of how the book treated these topics of teen sexuality, sex work, and sexual violence?
I can definitely see why he thought it was erotica, as in a lot of that book was essentially about one of the above, right? I think that it's kind of hard to say. It is spoken from the words of a survivor, and as it felt to me, though I might be projecting, a dissociative survivor to some extent. And I felt like it was a very real account, as in I've definitely had when I was raised, I was raised by a mother who was Christian and a father who was an atheist, and they disagreed on plenty of things, that being one of them. So I had these very odd ideas of love, sexuality, family, just very unusual, I couldn't really make sense of the world for most of my childhood growing up, right? Because of all the strangest messages that your culture, your environment throws at you. I feel like the way it dealt with sexual abuse is, in a way, very, very fragmented. That's actually probably a word I'm going to use quite often while talking about this book. And probably the series in general.
Interesting.
Because, yeah, I mean, the way it's done, like you have these like memories, right, of what Bob has done to her, and that it starts with, I think, when she was 12, and it was something like, I hope Bob doesn't come tonight. I think that was it. P.S. I hope Bob doesn't come tonight. Yeah. And that was the first mention of, oh, so this is going to be a creepy book instead of a happy to go. It was like picking up Madoka Magica, expecting a lighthearted manga. I was very wrong.
Spoilers for Madoka Magica.
Oops. Okay.
No, you're okay. You're okay.
Okay.
We reference random anime a fair amount on this podcast. You're good.
Yep.
Okay. Whew. So something that she shames herself a lot for her sexual thoughts, which is so sad. And I can remember doing that when I was younger too, and not sure if, are these thoughts bad? It's strange because for some reason, a bunch of people thought I was asexual. It's like, no, I am not. I mean, I guess by some definitions I might be, but like not in the way that I suspect most people are using it. And I do remember like the way that she felt upon like discovering her sexuality, and also the way she felt upon feeling like ashamed of these very normal thoughts, and then being surprised that, say, Donna had normal fantasies or something like that, right? Like, I remember there was something which, like, I think Laura, like, likes it rough, which might be around the time my partner said, is this erotica, Angela? Yeah. Anyway, it's so sad that she had this idea, which I also had when I was younger, in which I would repress all the thoughts that I thought were sinful because I did not realize that my thoughts alone weren't harming anybody. And honestly, the thoughts weren't even bad. Like, for example, I was attracted to girls, and I didn't really realize that it was attraction, mostly because when I was growing up, like, I couldn't figure out my feelings, right? I think it wasn't until I started seeing therapy consistently and such that I was able to go, oh, so this is the word for how I'm feeling. Yeah, because that was the first time I was using a sounding board to figure out my ideas. And that's why I'm really sad that Laura was other than this diary, which does not talk back. A diary cannot show love, right? A diary cannot really explain why Laura's cognitive distortions are distortions. Like, it can be a place where she can express herself, the only place she can, when she's too ashamed of everything she's doing in her infinite free time. To basically, yeah. Wow, I'm so jealous of this. Well, not the fact that she's like suffering and dead and stuff, but
Yeah, I think that especially with the points that you brought up, and just like having that outlet to kind of help teach you, show you, find the words for, it kind of makes Dr. Jacoby, you mentioned that he was shady, it kind of makes him more and more gross, because this is a person who was meant to be a professional in life, but in truth really turned Laura into more of an experiment, or just more so of a story to tell himself and listen to. Like, effectively, Dr. Jacoby had used Laura Palmer for his own fascinations, and that is really something.
You see a little bit of that in the book, but I think it comes through more in the show, especially season 1. You see that. It's very unfortunate, because we do see Laura reach out, and I think that adds an element of tragedy, the amount of people who in some way failed her. And that's not to say, you blame each of these people entirely for Laura's death or something, but you look at people like Donna, whose response to these situations is giggling whenever Laura confides something. You look at, obviously, her mother and father, who are either absent, negligent, or otherwise harmful to her. You look at even someone like Harold, who never intentionally hurt her. If anything, Harold might have been the closest thing to someone helping her she had.
Just a form of someone to speak to and an outlet.
Yeah. But he wasn't really enough. Like, you can't rely on him to get all the help you need. He was almost just unable to help her just due to his situation and his background. And like you said, Jacoby, the person who's most technically qualified to help someone with their psychology, the psychologist of the whole town, it seems. Because the rest of the show, Rue, they hardly ever, the only psychologist they ever go to for anyone's mental problems is Jacoby, which that's ominous that that's the best person for mental health in the whole town.
One thing the book and the TV series really brings out is a feeling of disorienting the reader and having you be like, you know how when you're a kid and nothing makes sense and everything is fascinating and you just feel everything you can and you want to explore the world and find out how everything works, right? Well, and then sometimes you learn that the people you care about, these fascinating humans, are very limited. And honestly, if there's only one therapist in this whole damn fucking town, I understand now the whole series how it came about. But yeah, the saddest part of the book and the series is the inability to accept how the people you might love and trust are sometimes going to be the people who hurt you the most or even kill you, whether intentionally or not. And if it is intentional, then it's sort of one of those, wow, this happened. If this could happen, what does it say about the world that this could happen? A world where time does not even exist, but death does. Like, wow, this is a pretty frightening thought, doesn't it? I mean, how can you protect yourself against such an unpredictable world where, you know, time is not of the essence?
Well, the characters act like time exists. We just, as a viewer, are confused half the time.
Yeah, and I find that someone close to me, Kalil, could kill me at any moment, but I use a long table in order to avoid the death.
Why are you blaming it on me? Anyway.
Listeners, you know if I disappear, what happened.
Aside from Laura Palmer, were there any characters that stood out in the book as interesting, remarkable? Obviously, Laura's the main focus. She's the one we're looking at here. But are there any characters around Laura's life that you thought were particularly noteworthy?
I actually cried at the section with Danielle, I think is the name. The little girl with the dead cat. Where like, and Laura realizing that, oh, I was the person who ran over my cat, sort of like the tomato in the mirror feeling, it was me all along, which is such a difficult, because when you're someone who has gone through something that you don't understand as a child, you might like in the future, and you might realize like, oh, sometimes like say you were the one who screwed up in one aspect or another when you were growing up, and everyone makes mistakes, but it takes a lot of courage. It's the strongest who can manage to face it and say in all certain and genuine remorse, I screwed up. Because for too many people, trying to justify all the other times they've made similar mistakes when they felt like the stakes were too high to admit that they did something that they shouldn't have, etc. When Danielle, when she saw Laura killing the cat, and all she could say was a very selfless response. I don't remember exactly what it is. Something like, why would I be mad at you? Like, you obviously, like, you're, like, crying over it as if it were your cat. Like, I could pretty much, number one, I felt extremely touched. And number two, I related so hard to that. Just, like, what Danielle said of, like, how could I be mad at you? Like, I don't know. Something about it, about how, like, this little girl who had suffered a lot at the hands of someone who, you know, caused essentially a humongous loss. But to understand that this person also understands what was lost and can't come back. At least there's a lot less loneliness for both the person whose cat got run over and Laura when her cat was run over, right? I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a lot of undercurrents of empathy throughout the book, at least I find. And I think it's tough because a book like this, especially dealing with more of the sexuality and being a teenage victim, it can get a bit exploitative if you're not careful when you're writing it. And I think it's always going to be a tricky balance of writing about things that are this uncomfortable in any situation, let alone writing about it so explicitly. There's no like metaphor being used. No, like Jennifer Lynch writes very clearly about the experiences from that first person perspective. And at least for me, it never really felt that exploitative. It felt much more empathetic. I was going to ask if that's kind of how you felt too, or do you feel like there were elements that were a bit exploitative?
What do you mean exactly by exploitative? Do you mean like gratuitous, like erotica or something?
That would be included, yeah. Just elements that feel like they're there to sensationalize, dramatize, or almost take advantage of the situation for book purposes. Like, it's not necessarily ethical. Was there any ethical dilemmas you had reading it?
I didn't feel like it was much sensationalized. I do recall thinking, well, I think it was like 99% very empathetic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember if there's anything I found particularly problematic, and nothing springs to mind, actually.
Okay.
Because, yeah, honestly, it's just the characters involved. They're very clearly flawed, right? But the writing itself was clearly, it read pretty much like a diary of a young girl who somehow has infinite free time and a lot of time to spend.
And an incredible vocabulary and writing style for a 12-year-old at the beginning. Yes.
Actually, I think that was pretty, like, I think at 12 I would probably write something similar to that. But then again, I had a lot of emotions at 12 years old, so, and plenty of free time to read and write about feelings.
All right.
But yes, thank you very much, Rue, for stopping by, and thank you very much for giving us your company. Now, is there anything that you're currently working on, or anything that our audience can check out that you're involved in?
We're working on a restorative justice hub. Basically, it's called I Regret It, and the website is at iregret.it, which is iregret.it. And restorative justice is justice that focuses on repairing the harm done to the victim, though we don't necessarily use the word victim usually. And it's a far cry from the current U.S. legal system, which is retributive justice, focused mostly on punishing perpetrators. Right now, the site is a minimum viable product. We are going to add more features later on. I'm coding the next iteration of an apology escrow, and there will also be ways for people to write essentially victim impact statement sort of things, so there wouldn't be just the apologizer framing the narrative and such. The current site has anonymous apologies, which is for free-form typing to work out one's emotions and getting something off your chest, say an apology to the dead or someone who otherwise can't ever read it. Right now, we're mostly looking for user interviews as we code the next iteration, but you could sign up, log in, and apologize directly to someone or anonymously. When the apology escrow comes out, then there will basically be much more information for you to decide on whether or not you should apologize, right? Like, you can tell if someone is interested in hearing an apology from you. You can tell if someone wants to know if they've done something wrong that they should apologize for, etc. Feel free to sign up as a new user and let me know how I can make it better. How it can help you, basically. Like, my end goal is to help the user.
Very well, very well. Well, genuinely, thank you very much, Rue, for your overall assistance today. And again, if anyone is interested in this current project, you can locate it at iregret.it.
So, Rue, thank you so much for overall joining us with this. This has been fantastic information that you have given us. We hope that you have a good time, and hopefully you can join us again in the future.
Thank you so much. This was very fun, and this was my first podcast. Wow, I've never done this before. I'm a lot less scared of podcasts now.
Well, I am glad to relieve you of some of that pain, because I know that I still fear podcasting to this very day.
And now, back to the regularly scheduled podcast.
But I have to ask, do we have enough evidence to construct the being that is known as Bob? In which, what does Bob stand for, Kalil?
Well, Bob clearly stands for beware of Bob.
Yep.
Which, what do you think of that acronym?
Do you think that, like, the ending of Bob is eternal then? Like, it's the end is never the end is never the end.
That's the sense I get. It's that eternal recurrence that Bob is only definable qua Bob, in the sense that you can't explain Bob without mentioning Bob, and therefore it's infinite loop of defining.
Honestly, the fact that he keeps sort of recurring inside of Laura's life, and something in which I don't think Bob's presence will ever completely disappear, I like this line of thinking, because otherwise I'll go insane of, you can't do an acronym where, like, the name is there.
It's either a teenage girl making a very dumb acronym that doesn't make sense, or we're meant to read into it in this ridiculous way where it's eternal recurrence, nightmare.
I wouldn't even call it ridiculous if it is recurrence. I think that actually is very nice.
I say ridiculous in the sense that it's beware of Bob and we're reading into it this much. I think we're probably, I agree with what we're doing.
Yeah.
I just have to take a step back and argue that, like, yeah, this is silly. But I think it's also, like, competently silly, and it's what makes sense. As far as creating any sort of understanding or timeline, we have glimpses and descriptions of maybe Bob's origins in Laura's life.
Yeah.
Obviously, with Leland, we only know so much from the series about the time at Pearl Lakes and where Bob was there. Mm-hmm. For Laura, she mentions that she knew Bob before age 12, but she doesn't necessarily have a definitive start point for Bob. We know that she first encountered Bob playing with Laura in the woods, which, again, combining that we know that Leland and Laura both enjoy the woods is concerning. Mm-hmm. That the woods were the place that Bob would be, and that's also the place that Laura would go with her father.
Yeah, no, it seems that it's very tied to the woods just in general, and the location is definitely suspect, but then again, I would say that this place is very charged with a unique spiritual nature that isn't found in many other places, if we are to fully delve into the fiction.
And the things that Bob would do in the woods when Laura was younger, again, younger than 12, we don't have a specific age here, are very, again, alarming sexually.
Yes.
That there are moments where Bob would make her say her name, and he would have this sort of laughing at her, and then she would be required by him to drop her undergarments, and he would then touch her inappropriately and comment about how dirty she is.
Yep.
And at this point, again, he's already saying, and will continue to say later, that Laura is this unclean person, this unclean thing.
Yeah.
And that's implied to be before age 12.
The best I could say is taking a note from the man from another place. For a lot of Bob's actions and what he does with Wow Bob Wow, Bob is very much the most uncomfortable thing. Here is the sort of final threshold as we continue to talk about Bob, because every time Bob comes up, it's not a good time. It's not a fun time.
Bob's having fun. That's about the only person having fun.
Only person that has a smile on his face, maybe. I don't know.
And we also want to make clear here, because I think at some points in this discussion it might be less clear. Bob in this story is acting through Leland, as well as seeming to be inside of Laura's psyche. They may or may not be the same Bob.
Yeah,
they might be reflections of each other. They might be the same. Who knows?
Yeah, but it may very well be the same Bob, especially with some of my beliefs with the end of the series with those doppelgangers, and there's a little bit of Bob and multiple people,
right,
and ended up with Cooper. It could be a sense where just the reaction of how Bob was just was so impactful for Laura that it's almost just similar. I will not diagnose, but it is similar to almost like a schizophrenia situation for her.
If someone wanted to try to read Twin Peaks the least mystically,
yes,
if they really wanted to remove all the supernatural elements, you could try to make a case that Bob is a figure that has been imagined in the Palmer family as sort of a placeholder, something that they can visualize and concretize in their mind as an enemy, as a lurking evil, to mask for the real damage that Leland's causing as a father and as a husband. You could argue that Bob, all he really is a mental construct that the family shares. And there's been cases of shared delusion in history. It's happened with, schools and larger communities, let alone a family. It's possible.
Yeah.
I personally do view it as a spiritual entity. I think it's both spiritual and psychological in the diary. But I just want to at least mention early on that you can view Bob as being mostly, if not all, psychological projection.
Okay.
Again, I think he is a spiritual entity. I think he is a parasitic predator of the Black Lodge. Where do you side on that? Do you think that this is a spiritual evil or something more projected?
I think that there is a little bit of me that kind of almost feels a little column A, a little column B.
I figured you'd say that.
Yeah, no, it is my... I never have a good time with singular thought because I feel that there can be instances where Laura Palmer is personally very well affected by what would echo in Bob's thoughts that would be present psychologically. It is something that she basically ends up telling herself, but with Bob as an antagonist, may use Bob's voice to encourage those actions. Meanwhile, especially with some of the more literal and physical actions that ends up coming out of it, I think that there might be a larger spiritual presence. Now, mind you, there could even be instances where this is vice versa. It's what makes Bob disgusting, detestable, but also in the same breath intriguing and something that one might want to dissect on what Bob is in general.
Like, for example, we know that someone has been seeing Laura's diary, like when she's I think 13 or 14, she notices someone's looking at her diary. She moves it at that point. Yeah. We know that later on pages are being removed. It's being read. That could be Leland. That could be just straightforward Leland. And that would make sense. There's an earthly explanation for that. It's never confirmed in the diary, but it could be Leland.
Yes.
And again, if you were to read this book before knowing Leland's the killer, you would only have so many people you think could be having access to her diary if it's in her room.
But there's also questions that, for one, there are dips in tone, in complete dips in mood, in which it's almost as if you're reading from a different Laura.
And in the audiobook, we do hear Cheryl Lee do the Bob voice.
Yeah, and that is pretty impactful on its own. And the way that she does deliver, you could almost say it's one way Bob can be fully interpreted from one perspective. Not to mention, there are notes. I couldn't find much correlation myself, but I'm sure maybe there could be some avid Twin Peaks viewer out there that might be able to look into what it means for Laura to just shortly sign off as L, whether it's just a quick emotional beat or if it is something deeper than that.
Right.
And then sign off as Laura at other times.
I think there might be some she didn't even sign at all, if I remember correctly.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe you're correct.
Where she was in such an emotional state or hurry where she didn't get the chance to even do the L.
To say that there might be an emotional state where she might herself tear out pages, or dependent on the scenarios that she is in deep inebriation with things such as substances, who's to say that might not occur to her as well?
And this is where, again, I think it helps to look at all the different angles. If Bob is a spiritual entity, then we are heavily implied that it wants to jump into Laura's body and take over, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
If it is a mental construct, it reminds me of the idea, one, she's on drugs, like cocaine and other drugs that might be affecting her mind.
Yes.
With the way she's getting these drugs, who knows what these drugs might be laced with sometimes. Where she's getting them is shady at best.
Yes.
I don't trust Leo with drugs, to be honest. I don't trust Leo with most things. But even aside from the drug situation, you have someone who's experiencing enormous amounts of trauma and guilt. And it makes sense to me that if she already has this idea in her head that her brain is in denial of Leland, it's in denial that her father could be doing this. Yeah. She has to, in her mind, subconsciously conjure up an artificial character named Bob, because that's the only way her brain can process Leland doing this to her. Then it makes sense that when Laura starts to feel that, oh, I'm becoming a woman now. Oh, I'm having sexual thoughts. Sexual thoughts equal Bob. Again, it makes sense because all she's known from a young age involving sexuality is Bob. Like you said, the first initial in that list of people she's been with romantically and sexually is B for Bob.
Now, we have to also consider what, like, it might mean. Again, it might go deeper into shared consciousness, but we have to also recall that Leland is the one who comes forward when it comes to the image of Bob.
Yeah.
Maybe because he personally recognized the reflection firsthand, or it is just how ingrained Bob is in his own memory. Yeah. Imagine, like, what Leland Palmer's diary would look like itself if, like, Bob stuck out that hard to him.
Well, in the way he describes that he was shown Bob in the woods at, well, I don't know if it was set at woods, but it was near Pearl Lake.
Near Pearl Lake, which whenever you are nearby a lake area, yeah.
And the man who would show, was flicking the matches saying you want to play with fire. I mean, the way I've read that sequence is that I do wonder, again, if Leland had been a victim of sexual abuse as a child.
Yeah.
And that summer home, he had encountered something that, again, if Bob is a mental construct, that the idea of Bob, at least for Leland, started with his sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of rot within the family that sexuality has become something repulsive and has become something twisted.
I think that noting of his presence with Bob and how that moves on to Laura, we might even want to consider, I think I brought it up earlier, that there might be a legacy aspect to it.
Yeah.
Something that sort of dials down. If it's someone that he may have seen directly in the woods, or like how Laura says that she met him in the woods, if maybe Leland's parents may have done the same.
The original series did a very strong job correlating Bob to violence, showing Bob delighting in killing. But even when we had Maddie's death, there's that sense of Bob is dancing with her during the death, but also like kissing her in a very animal-like way.
Yes.
And I think one of the greatest contributions the diary gives to the character of Bob, to the entity of Bob, is the sexual element. That Bob is correlated almost consistently with the idea of sexuality. There's a moment where Laura tries to summon Bob in the woods to almost like confront him. Like she is going to do everything she can to face him and fight him. Because the way she kind of thought of it is that if he knows I'm looking for him, that's going to kill the fun. If, she said, there's no fun in a game of torture if the victim is screaming for more. So she's out in the woods and she is doing all these things, thinking all these thoughts to try to conjure up Bob. And it actually, well, for one, it doesn't seem to get Bob there. But what it does do is it excites her. And that's, again, one of those moments where it seems to be that tipping point toward she's conflating Bob with sexuality. And it's doing things that are layered. It's causing her fear, but it's also causing her pleasure. And that mixture is often dangerous for her.
Really, whenever it comes to the ideas of what Laura is trying to do, mixed in with sort of like Bob's super hypertension, just desire in, like, I would say in just massive wild quantities. Mm-hmm. He really is truly a glutton in that respect. I would also say that with her kind of like chasing down Bob, let's just face it, even if the game dies down, unfortunately, if we use a fishing metaphor, taking something like the catch that Laura is, and then using her as a dangling piece, that is what did draw someone like Agent Dale Cooper in.
Yes, I believe I came up with that analogy in the last podcast.
I can't remember if that was the exact wording, but it definitely is something that, with the context of the diary, could be strengthened.
I had mentioned the idea of Wyndham Earle and Annie being used as lures.
I think that
on a fishing rod. Now, Laura is the original lure for Cooper.
I think that's especially with how she is sort of wrapped up and in a river, is notable for that as well. If we are to try to go from the point A to point B, this little narrative rhyming scheme, because it also does come to an end with Laura as well. So yeah, if it wasn't for all those cases, who knows where Wyndham Earle would have ended up, and if Cooper was able to catch up and keep him in mind, because Wyndham Earle needed this place too.
In a lot of those exchanges between Laura and Bob, there's this in her diary, in her writing, Bob basically claims credit for any of the sexual knowledge that Laura has. And you can read that again as the spirit that is possessing Leland, being able to claim credit because Laura's first sexual encounters might have been with Leland. You can also read it as, again, if Bob is being conflated in her mind with her sexual experiences, then the distinction between where Laura ends and where Bob begins is very, very hazy.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter how you view it, anytime that she starts doing these things that she thinks she's doing to make herself feel good, she's doing it to heal wounds, she says, Bob will then turn it on its head and said, well then, if that's what it's for, why do you want Leo to tie you up? Why do you want Leo to make you his slave? And again, we talked a little bit about how this book has treatment of LGBT. I think there's also the concern of how it portrays BDSM and kink communities.
I think that, in truth, there is some positive aspect. If it weren't for like the fact that where Laura is in age-wise and the questionable legalities of that, I think that overall having a community where you are able to explore yourself sexually and have people that's supportive enough that if you do go too far, you are tended to and you're taken care of, I see no issue with that. But we are definitely masked with a certain tone on what happens with Laura, on what happens with, well, eventually all these other characters that go into a darker mask. I think that the only one in the main series that doesn't really have this darker light placed onto them is Rona Pulaski.
May I agree with you, but then also offer a bit of a complication and rebuttal to it?
Please.
I think that you're mostly right. One problem, though, that persists that I still do feel partly is, sure, there might be some elements of it's being represented and it often has a positive effect for those of age. However, there's a conflation in this book between those who are in the BDSM or kink communities and those who are preying on children. Because it seems like the people at Leo's parties do not care about the age. If anything, a lot of them are into that sort of role play of the bigger man wanting the mommy character and the conflation with the little girl character. There's this sort of feeling that the book doesn't really separate the people who are doing it in a healthy way versus the predators. They're the same group of people.
Which I do take as the tone of the book.
Yeah.
I don't know how the representation would have gone.
Again, Doc Hayward. Have Doc Hayward be gay and into the kink community just on the side, but he's a good guy still.
Right.
With chainsaw arms.
With chainsaw arms.
Of course, all three areas of representation.
Nothing can go wrong here.
But yeah, in all seriousness, it's one of the limitations of the book's focus is that because it is telling an almost incredibly depressive story, that there's very little that is, in terms of sexuality at least, that's portrayed in a positive way in Laura's life. It does inadvertently cast a sort of conflation between bisexuality, kink community, and predatory natures.
Yes.
And unfortunately, everything in Laura's life that's related to things she does to make herself feel good is bad. In some way, really, or in her mind. There's that element of the drugs. There's the element of the sex. And because, again, the story is what it isn't showing it being used in a healthier or more morally responsible way.
Yes.
And this culminates in this sort of feeling with Laura that by the time she's 16 and pregnant, that she is thinking of death. That she is thinking of death as a companion she hasn't met yet. And it's in response to this sort of idea. Bob says, sometimes life is about what happens before death. I wanted to see what could be done. And refers to Laura as an experiment. Or rather, Laura asks, am I just an experiment? And Bob is like, yeah, pretty much. So she's the one that poses the idea, and Bob is the one that replies. What did you think of this moment where Laura is having this sort of ideation? This is also where she has the pregnancy. And Bob's replies. What did you think of this overall element of the story?
I mean, my main thought about this whole entire situation continues on what I feel about generally the journal itself. It feels uncomfortable. It feels something in which you worry about someone that's unfortunately, well, obviously it's fiction, but even if you were to indulge yourself fully into the fiction, to someone who is not there, someone's just direct struggles, and the only voice that reaches out is an echo of just pain. And no, overall, my thoughts on it are something I don't like. Anticlimactic, I'm sure. I don't think I can describe the amount of discomfort that things like this give forward, and it is, in a word, unfortunate.
While I simultaneously fully understand and fully declare that this book is not for everyone, this is not a type of book that many people are going to want to read.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, artistically, I'm glad we have books like this. And one of the difficulties then becomes is trying to figure out what is the point of this book. You know, we could ask Jennifer Lynch what her intentions were, but there's also that death of the author idea here at play. What is the point of a book like this? We talked a little bit earlier about fiction being a way of understanding the world around us, but at the end of the day, let's say this just exists for art's sake. Do you think art and stories that make you uncomfortable like this are good?
I think that it's important for works like this. I think that dependent on the framing of the book and how it treats that sense of media, it can be important for people to explore pain like this. It can be important for people to understand things that might be outside of their realm or thought. Like, for example, I cannot relate to Laura on so many ends, but at the same time, that's what makes it also a very fascinating window and something to consider, especially whenever it comes to people who might be in that situation that one might encounter in the future. And I think that there's an importance for it. But again, it puts so much responsibility on the author's end for that respect.
Yeah.
So I do. It's not that painful works can't exist. It's just that it absolutely needs the right person at the desk.
And Jennifer Lynch seems to have been the right person for this book.
I think so, too. I think that this was an important read for those who do want to look more into a painful experience for a person. Because other than this, there are only very, 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 very light things touched on throughout Twin Peaks, in which I would not condone against the reading that I would have, in which I might put Laura Palmer in this like eldritch sense. And there, you could even still argue with the presence of this book on something either being born out of
I almost think it moves away for me of thinking of Laura as the Lovecraftian horror monster and Laura's pain being that monster. And there's a difference.
I don't know if I make as much of a difference as you may. I feel that the pain can simply be a vessel in which Laura Palmer herself is simply the egg to hatch into what we see in the place. But I gotta say, I did mention before, I wanted a book of Bob. I basically got it here, Kalil, and I'm sorry.
Go on. Toward the end of the diary, Laura says that she knows who and what Bob is. She has to tell everyone, tell someone and make them believe. What do you think she comes to realize about Bob? And also, what have you come to realize about Bob in reading this?
If I may state, and this is my reading, this is my viewing of what Bob is. Bob is pain unattended to. Bob is something in which either by direct ignorance, for environment's sake, for the need to run and use methods to try to escape, Bob is a presence for something in which something is either not being treated or being improperly treated, for how effective and how present he is and how powerful he can become throughout something like Laura Palmer's life, in which she really didn't have much escape. For Leland Palmer, whose environment involved Benjamin Horne and his overall activities, I imagine he either was too busy to ever attend to his own personal issues or definitely masked it in a sense of happiness and glee. Only when he experiences his emotions and lets them flood through, we don't see Bob throughout the series. Only when he comes to terms and then just, I would say, maybe even buries it deep enough that he no longer has to tend to it, that he almost like I'd say maybe even abandons it, but not really addresses it that may have been the most healthy ways, that Bob starts to peek through yet again, because Bob is completely absent throughout that time and then becomes very present afterwards. There's also the matter with Cooper, where his experiences in the Black Lodge, what he has to face afterwards, and the thing that Bob captures him with is a lot of that reflection and that pain unattended to, and what that conflates with his relationship with Annie and his final words with Annie, that I think that might still be connected with things like Catherine.
I feel silly.
Carolyn.
I feel silly that we never said this, but the fact that he sees Maddie, Laura, Leland, Caroline, these are people that died on his watch, right? Well, Laura was before him, but Maddie died because he didn't catch it fast enough. Leland died after being in custody. There is this sort of sense, Caroline died, and then Annie could be next.
Yeah.
And it is the weight of that blood trail on him that he has left behind, and that if you look at it, like you're saying, as pain unattended to, you have a point. Is there anyone else in Twin Peaks that you think would be susceptible then to Bob, if it's referring to pain unattended to? Who else do you think could be susceptible to something like Bob?
If I had to guess, I mean, from the last episode, if there was someone to not acknowledge reality and dig deeper into a hole, Donna Hayward.
Okay.
She retracts herself and just like a child says, "You're my daddy," and will not face a potential reality. And that itself can be frustrating. I can only hope that Doc Hayward, as well as Eileen Hayward, end up attending to those emotions properly, because she has a loving home with receptive parents that have been very supportive of her. There's likely that there might be an end of escape. It's just going to be dependent on Donna as a recipient, on how much that affects that idea of purity, on that idea of how well she is. And hey, you could even say that about where she comes from and why she is in this very opposite reflection of Laura Palmer. So yeah, I think that is the most notable character, especially since I don't know how many characters make it out alive at the end.
It is a giant question mark, right?
Yes.
So I have a category called just dreams non-Bob. So any dream that is not specifically Bob related.
Yes.
I'm just going to list a few, and we'll just jump into the ones we want to jump into a bit.
Okay.
So there's one that she has with a bearded man who has coal black fingers. There's one with a tiny man who goes inside of her. There is a moment in a dream where she's biting off her own foot before a rat could get to it. There's one where she has a dream of her dad and mom finding photos of her engaged in sexual activity with women. And then there is a dream where she is performing on a stage sexually with someone that she called up. Are there any of those particular dreams that struck you that you might want to dive into a bit deeper or had some thoughts on?
I mean, for one, a bearded man with black fingers, was it? Definitely is an opposing visual to what we see with Leland Palmer with the white gloves.
Yes.
So
coal black. I mean, one, there's the black element, but also coal being another thing like oil, like gasoline that can cause energy.
And as we discussed before, I can't think of many bearded people to sort of connect that to. Inside
Who would have thought of our question about who you'd cosplay as would actually have relevance now?
I have to almost question, just because we don't really know necessarily the alignments, intentions, or well-beings of some characters.
Right.
Do we interpret Philip Gerard, one bearded man, that the more parasitic-natured being within him might have also one arm? Or
Philip Gerard's tough because we've seen elements of him, but he's another one of those characters that fell away surprisingly in season 2. We just don't really bring up Philip Gerard very often.
He fell away before, like, in instances where he goes to the bathroom. So
but no one ever followed up on that.
In the cracks.
The fact that no one really followed up on Philip Gerard is I think, really telling and interesting if we do take it as a thing in the narrative.
Okay.
I almost just feel like casting-wise, maybe it didn't work out, or maybe they couldn't think of any plot lines for him. But if we do take it, seriously, canonically, that means that the sheriff's department in Cooper didn't think it'd be necessary to follow up on how the guy's doing after, everything that went down with the haloperidol and Mike.
They got all the information they needed out of him. He
wouldn't be helpful.
Sell his shoes.
Totally wouldn't be someone to ask about the white and black lodges. Nope.
He's a big, busy man that wants to try to sell his shoes.
But to go back to the idea of it being possibly conflated with the dream here, it is tough because we know that he claims he cut off the one arm when he saw the face of God. What that means is as good of your guess as probably as mine at this point.
And the timing of it. We don't know when that might have happened. Who would be the entity that one would consider or give forward to God?
Yeah.
Or of what purpose, like cutting one's arm off to God would imply. So that is very iffy on its own.
Yes. The dream about the rats and the biting off their own foot, that one feels pretty clearly as an allegory for she would rather inflict her own pain to herself than wait for someone else to inflict it on her.
Yeah.
It might connect to the suicidal ideation, but it also connects to Bob. If we take Bob as being like the rat entity, she even compares Bob to a rat at some point in the diary.
Yeah, no, this is like, she literally goes into actions for the pure sake of trying to one-up Bob.
Right. And then the dream I guess I found the most interesting outside of the Bob ones was the one with the mom and dad finding the photos. Because in her dream, she imagines her mom and dad remarking upon these photos and almost judging her for them. There's this kind of taunting nature to the tone of their voice that she interprets. And it reads to this sort of anxiety that she has, not only in being seen as unclean, as someone being seen as promiscuous, but the specific fear of being seen as a lesbian. And that's something that pops up now and then in the story, that she's afraid of being judged for being interested in women. And I think that's another one of those areas where if we look at Bob and a lot of her frustrations and anxieties as being more down-to-earth, realistic, physical rather than spiritual, that sort of anxiety about the attractions that she feels being inappropriate in some way. This was like printed in 1990.
Yeah.
This is, there were obviously movements in the LGBT community, but not wide acceptance. And we don't know the makeup of Twin Peaks. We know the way that Hawk and others reacted to Denise Bryson.
Yep.
But there is that sense of, I don't think in this community and in this sort of small town 90s environment, a teenage girl being bisexual or having interest in women would be at all accepted. And that if she told Donna this, if she told people like her parents or kids at school or Doc Hayward, there's a substantial chance that she would be judged.
Yeah, it is something that definitely could put fuel on the fire for Bob to exploit.
There's an earlier entry where she even speculates that if she felt that if people didn't have to live up to labels like gender roles, she thinks the world would be a safer place.
Yeah.
And that seems to be part of her element also when it comes to Leo's parties, is that feeling that it doesn't matter who's there, how old they are, what gender they are, what they do during work, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just the pure presence of other people. There's that sort of almost pansexual mindset that Laura exhibits in the story that, again, because of the nature of this book, it gets intermixed with unhealthy thoughts and unhealthy emotions, so that even the things that in of themselves would be fine or even good, they get dragged down into the mud with everything else Laura is.
Yeah, no, I'm of the belief that whenever it comes towards gender norms, it's very easy to get in sort of that toxic nature, or very easy to get lost in a mindset of maybe someone feels like there's something taboo wrong with them, and that sort of coalesced fear is horrifying. So yeah, no, oh gods, poor Laura, poor a lot of people who likely have or are currently facing situations like this. It's sad. It really is sad. Meanwhile, with the tiny man that kind of appears inside, could you just say lightly on the events of that dream quick?
Sure. So there's this dream where I believe Laura's 13. It was one of the earlier dreams in the book. And she experienced her first climax. And it was in the dream. And in that moment, she has the dream of this man opening her up. And it's described as taking soft control.
Yeah.
And she is instructed basically to close her eyes. And when she opens her eyes later, the man is gone. And all of a sudden, she's pregnant, or at least has the appearance of pregnant. And the way she describes it is that the man had become tiny and gone inside of her.
Yeah.
So it's almost this sort of magical realism, surrealist take on the idea of being impregnated.
Yes, and with her relationships with sexual activity, especially when considering something like Bob, having that felt presence of someone, I don't think that there's really any point inside the book where I think that she may have been necessarily glad to have a piece of someone within her like that. And having that sort of perspective definitely puts a tone when the future pregnancy does happen. Two things I want to bring up. One, a lot of the dreams in general are not good dreams. I think that's easy enough to say, but as far as the framing on this goes, having someone take that control, even soft control, and her real push to having control, I wonder how that really does impact things emotionally, especially. And with that, and just kind of like considering the tone of just some of these dreams, could you also recite a little bit on the audience one just to help my memory?
Sure, and there might be more dreams that I didn't jot down, especially later in the book. I noticed I wasn't taking as many of the notes. Again, I have double what I normally have as it is. But there was a dream where Laura was calling people up to be on a stage, and she would perform sexual acts in front of an audience. She describes it as being both men and women that she would call up, and just sort of the audience reacting and having that sort of direct attention on them, and her main focus being the person on stage making them feel good in front of that audience. And it's one of those situations where she views sexuality as a form of healing, as a form of almost meditation away from her problems.
Okay.
Because this is not one of those cases where she takes the sexuality as a form of a weapon or revenge that it later becomes with people like Josie.
Yeah.
This is definitely more of a case where she's using it to make herself and others feel good.
I think that something very notable about it is that from the dreams we have listed, unless some have been left out, and I do apologize if that is the case, it seems the biggest theme with all these dreams is something that might be painful, something that might be reflective of later that might cause pain. This is actually probably one of the more pleasant dreams because of something important to her. In fact, having that sort of presentation, that sort of stage, might even highlight a little bit of her presence inside of the Black Lodge or the waiting room of it. Someone who is in more so of attire and presentation and still gives off a sexual lure. I mean, the biggest picture for Twin Peaks, I think that might be a part of that waiting room is Laura Palmer very suggestively enjoying Dale Cooper's lips. So. Okay.
I never thought of it as being that suggestive, but that's interesting to me that you read it that way.
I think that there is a means of I think there's a means of attraction less on the ends of romantic and more on the ends of a siren's call, in which I feel that there is something that can be inherently put sexually, but again, I still interpret it as a sense of Cooper's attachment to the case. I think that there can be a little bit more of an amorphous sexual sort of give that emotion in the situation.
Your specific wording of comparing Laura Palmer to a siren made me have a thought that a siren's call is no less dangerous even if the siren is calling sincerely.
Yes.
Even if the siren's call is out of genuine emotion, such as sorrow, such as grief, even if the siren intends well, that siren's call leads the captain to crash his ship into the rocks.
Yep.
Regardless of why the siren's calling. I think that that's another way to think about Laura and her pain being painful not only to Laura, but also to other people.
I think that definitely was either something that we could also make a little bit of a comparison with what ends up happening to Dale Cooper.
Yeah.
But we could also say with B, I would almost say the reason why she might just keep people out because the people around her couldn't help her in that respect. It would just only lead to ruin around her. And yep, again, very, very sad.
Right. One of the overarching themes throughout the diary, even though it's not always explicitly discussed, is Laura's relationship with the idea of growing up and becoming older.
Yeah.
We obviously see through the diary her moving forward from age 12 to age 16 by the end. But there's moments where she's excited, especially younger. She can't wait to grow up. She can't wait to be the only one that can make herself feel good or bad, to have a sense of control as she gets older. She imagines that as she gets older, she'll have more freedoms and more responsibilities, and that will result in more control over her life.
Yes.
And when she starts engaging in things like smoking, like drinking, like sex, it makes her feel mature. It makes her feel like a grown woman. And again, that's how she describes it, not me interpreting it that way. And there's this sort of feeling that Laura wants to grow up, wants to be an adult, just to skip the adolescent period entirely. There's so much anxiety about adolescence in this book that some of it is resulting from sexuality, some of it's relating from her body, but then also even just, again, the state of being in that transition. She wants to just go straight to being a mature adult woman. And unfortunately for her, that's something she never quite reaches. And there's also moments in here where she talks about not wanting to ever have kids, because she says that the moment you have kids, you forget what it was like to be a kid yourself. And again, it makes you wonder, is that referring to Sarah and Leland and their parenting especially?
Okay.
That, they no longer understand what it's like to be Laura or be a kid, because in her mind, once you have that child, you lose that. And of course, we mentioned before, there is that moment with the abortion where she has these sort of bittersweet emotions over it, where she clearly does not want to have a child at this time in her life, but she also is wanting this child, the spirit, to come back later. She's calling to this child that when Laura is no longer a child herself, she says when there's a union or a marriage, come back.
Yeah.
She's almost wanting to put the baby away and bring it back later.
That's kind of the theme with Laura Palmer, like when she is growing up, when she thinks she needs these defenses, it's mostly in the reason of she needs to aid the future self that she can bring back. There is a active dissonance between this wide-eyed Laura Palmer that looked up to someone like Maddie Ferguson as opposed towards the more bitter one. And hey, all I'm saying is that if there is actually two selves that could come out spiritually, and the fact that Maddie Ferguson is the one that sort of appeared, hey, maybe we didn't see a funeral, we didn't see anyone really in pain afterwards.
Again, Maddie's funeral is probably in Missoula.
It's maybe in Missoula, Montana, but we never saw it. All I'm saying is that if this pure ideal of someone like Maddie, of where Laura Palmer wanted to grow up into, and that spiritual character made manifest, like some have in the past. Hey.
Okay. I'll let you continue to delude yourself that way.
I am going to sit in this corner drinking from this little water bottle and sketching down wildly into my journal. Thank you very much.
Speaking about drinking and journaling, let's talk about drugs for a little bit here. That's my segue. Don't put your eye into the microphone, Professor. Back in episode 1, you told me not to put my eye into the microphone. Now you're doing it.
It's all comes full circle.
I have a little bit to say on these, not super much. We can maybe just talk in general. We know that Laura smokes fairly young. She also starts drinking around that time, we're led to believe. There's a moment where she compares smoking to blowing out your spirit.
Okay.
And around the time with Josh and Tim, she begins smoking marijuana. This is when she says that I know drugs are bad, but I'm starting to feel like I like being that way, kind of bad. Cocaine, obviously, is the drug Laura was most interested in, and it's the one she's most remembered for. Leo was the one to give her cocaine first, and she was proud that she could hold her own when she took it.
Yeah.
She would use Bobby for cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, probably cigarettes too. By the time she's on to cocaine, though, I'm not sure how much the cigarettes did for her.
Yeah.
Heroin, notably, she said, is an idiot's drug. Heroin she would not touch.
Heroin's too far.
And she said she wouldn't shoot that up her arm. And there's a little bit in the story about Blackie. And I didn't really have Blackie as a separate character because really it's just the heroin part here that Blackie shows up.
Yeah.
And they kind of have this moment of verbal back and forth where Laura makes fun of how Blackie is unable to remember things because she's on heroin. And then Blackie retorts that Laura should stop frolicking in the snow, referring to the cocaine.
Yeah.
And of course, because this is later on when Laura's mentality has become more twisted, she then uses sexuality as a way to overpower Blackie and show dominance.
Yep.
Similar to what happens with Josie, similar in the element that yet another bisexual character, another bisexual woman, is shown in that sort of negative conquest light. Mm-hmm. Again, we've talked about it, problematic, but also that's the nature of this book. Mm-hmm. Is there anything involving drugs with Laura Palmer that we haven't said that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, the most I can really say about the things like drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and etc. is something that I've sort of reiterated throughout, especially on the latter end of this podcast. Mm-hmm. I don't feel that necessarily when it comes down to drugs, dependent on where and how it's used and how someone is treated afterwards is very important. And the fact that Laura sort of uses these items almost like in the sense of feeling good, and there is a little bit of questioned power to it, it is something in which is completely unintended except by her own whims and her environments. So it's just another layer next to sex that is traditionally in media shown as a deep taboo, but definitely something that people can fall into whenever it comes towards dealing with pain.
Mm-hmm. And there's a moment where Laura Palmer does pursue sobriety. She's adding all these different things to her agenda and meeting different people. That's when Meals on Wheels starts.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's short-lived. She can't really exist in the world without drugs anymore, it feels like, for her. Mm-hmm. There's a sense in which, she is legitimately being hindered by a genuine cocaine addiction.
Yeah, if there's more treatment that would be available to them, like certain countries would be able to provide to Laura Palmer, maybe things would be different. But again, she mostly goes heavily on her own without much of a support net.
I would also say that Laura is a case point where if she was incarcerated or given a sentence in prison or a fine, that would not help her.
No,
I think she's another case where helping drug addicts is more important than imprisoning them.
I think that in general, whenever it comes down to it, there is a significant problem with incarceration, especially with that, how it just generally affects people and how people get stuck in these ruts and situations.
In the United States specifically.
And specifically the United States, where we presently are. So it is horrifying on where people can end up and how these vices might just be that moment of escape for people.
And it feels like what the drugs end up doing is accelerating this constant high and low state in Laura's mind, where she's having these moments almost of just pure bliss and then sinking down into these moments of absolute self-hatred and self-loathing.
Yeah.
And this creates a very running current of anxiety throughout the book. Part of it's religious. We don't necessarily know fully the background of the Palmer family and Laura. Okay. She has a basic idea of God, but her idea of God is a little more complicated. She makes this comment early on that she doesn't want to be near Jesus when she dies because she's worried that Jesus will judge her. She says that she knows at church and family and friends, they all say Jesus is forgiving, but in her mind, if people don't understand her, Laura Palmer, and they are around her all the time, how do they know what God is like? How do they know what Jesus is like? So she has this sort of questioning nature. If they can't understand the pain she's going through and that she has a darker side, how is she to assume that God or Jesus will forgive her?
I think that trying to pursue something like look at something that is an entity that one might consider pure, especially not delving deeper into those elements and just going by the face value of such an entity. It's the same thing that sort of like draws Laura back away from pure people like Donna, what she considers pure. Yeah, that is.
And Bob even uses this sort of religious line as well, where he comments that Laura isn't a child of God because she bleeds between the legs. It's less about Laura's actions here and more about having a female anatomy.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an especially telling moment of how, again, Bob is used either psychologically or spiritually as a constant prodding about anxiety over puberty, over growing into a woman.
There's also the amount of social pressures whenever it comes towards being a woman. And as what I've seen, I myself I have not read the Bible from back of book to front of book.
I have.
He has. So I don't know how much you might be able to say. I have seen.
Well, as a biblical scholar, no, not at all.
No.
But what is your question?
So I have seen like interpretations whenever it comes towards things like the Christian faith, where the image and the overall use of the feminine figure is something that is more condemned and something in which one might be just more fully dressed around. Like the idea of that feminine figure needs a bit of modesty added to it. And to say Laura Palmer's modest is not inside of this field. It's something in which I wonder whether or not having the ideals, especially in what I may have first seen myself, personal experiences in an American Christian-based valued area, how more condemned she may feel more than she is saved from sharing any of this information, seeking out that religion.
So again, just to clarify, I am no expert. I went through a period in my life and high school and early college where I read a lot of different religious texts. I read the Bible front to back. Not the ideal way to read the thing, by the way. From my experiences, no offense to anyone who likes to read it that way, but even most Christians and most Jews, I think, would agree that the traditional Old Testament contains some books that are more exciting than others. And I can only read so many pages about how to build a tabernacle before I'm like, all right, I should have skipped around to, like Jonah with the big fish, or Job. That's a fun time for everyone. That's a joke. Anyway.
I don't think I'd agree with the sentiment. I think that's like reading it directly like that.
Genesis is a good starting point. I don't mind Genesis as a starting point. It's that you get so much like law and rules based early on in the, again, Christian Old Testament.
You need to set up your rules and logic whenever it comes towards your story, so sometimes the laws have to be explained.
Okay, all right, well, sure. So yeah, to speak more generally, though, I think that there's an element within Abrahamic religions, so not just Christianity, but Judaism as well as Islam, that does look at modesty as a virtue.
Yes.
You have in the Christian Bible and the Old Testament the sort of idea of adultery as a recurring sin. It's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. And the idea of sleeping with someone who is not your spouse is pretty clearly consistently identified as a sin and something that is against God throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. Where it gets specific with women is depending on where you're looking.
Yeah.
A lot of the times in the New Testament with Jesus, he's going among prostitutes. He's going among, and I use prostitute because that's what most translations would say. He's going among sex workers. And he is going among people who are often considered outcasts and dirty. And one of the things that is notable then about the Jesus element of the New Testament is that a lot of times he's going to those people trying to heal, trying to help them out, trying to help them recover, and looking at the unclean as the people most in need of help. In general, he's pointing at the rich and those involved in authority as the people that are beyond help, not the people who are at the bottom.
Not on all cases.
Laura Palmer would be the person Jesus would go to in the New Testament. Where it gets tricky, though, is you have situations where it's like Paul, who wrote a lot of the epistles, or at least they're credited to him, where it's women should be seen and not heard at the church. That's where you get those sort of verses that look at the role of women as being more rigid than we have typically now in the 21st century.
Yes.
And where you end up with a lot of Orthodox groups looking at the role of women as being more quiet, more modest, more staying at the home. Christianity is such a wide group of people and wide group of beliefs that there's a whole range among them.
Yeah.
But, like you said, a traditional American Christianity in the 90s, yeah, I think there's that element that sexuality be taboo. It's not something that they would necessarily want to be taught wildly. You have a lot of churches nowadays still, and back at that time, who wanted to have prayer at schools. They wanted to have a more orthodox way of educating the youth in sort of these pious thoughts.
Yeah.
And Laura's thoughts often bent it away from the pious.
Yeah.
So I think that the views toward women are complicated within the Bible. I think the majority of Christians now would argue the case that the Bible overall looks at women as being equal to men and wants that equality.
Okay.
But interpretations and translations of the Bible range so much that we don't know what church Laura grew up in. We don't know what sort of background her family had.
Yeah.
But the basic idea that maybe those sort of puritanical beliefs might have affected her life. Yeah. And that sort of fear of the Lord, I think Laura's version of the fear of the Lord is a bit more leaning on the fear. Like, I think there's this element that she's scared of judgment constantly. She's scared that what she's doing is going to render her permanently unclean.
I think that there's also the sense of fear that even if she is to seek this out, a lot of the things that would give her comfort, the things that she would lean on and give her the things that she desired, that sense of power, she might feel that she might need to repent against that.
Yeah.
And let's just face it, when she did try to, that made her suffer as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And aside from just the religious biblical background that I'm assuming, this is an assumption, I'm assuming that Laura went to Sunday school, was brought up in a somewhat religious upbringing here.
Judging from like the recognition
Yeah.
from the person who attended her funeral.
And what I then wonder is that there's moments where she also talks about herself almost as like a fairy princess.
Yeah.
I almost think that sort of religious background is gelled in her mind with the other sort of stories a child might hear.
Okay.
That she hears about God, she hears about Jesus the same way that a child will hear about Santa Claus and hear about fairies and princesses. And I think that they hold relatively equal weight in the 13-year-old mind of Laura Palmer, because there's a moment where she talks about being a fairy princess who is rescued from the tower that she's trapped in. But she says the man who rescues her wants to go inside her to ride her like an animal, and she hopes it's not a bad thing to think that way.
Another thought whenever it comes down to having someone inside of her, again, my brain goes to that little man dream.
Mm-hmm. And in of itself, the basic thought of burgeoning sexual interest, there is nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
The problem is that she's so consumed with this cycle of guilt, where the moment she has any sexual thoughts, she equates it with Bob, she equates it with being evil and unclean, and it creates this endless loop of her blaming herself and feeling gross about herself. And that's a very dangerous cycle to end up in.
Absolutely.
And another cycle that is in the book, but isn't there a lot? I don't know if it should be there more or not, but she appears to have an eating disorder at some points in the narrative. There are moments where she talks about having anxiety over her diet, and she writes about avoiding meals. Mm-hmm. The extent to this eating disorder, the extent to how active it is, how frequent it is, how severe it is, I don't think it's touched upon very strongly. Mm-hmm. But considering that Laura's involved with drugs, involved with other things that are going to affect her physical health,
not
it's
just
hard
physical
to know
health, like
mental health, everything.
Well, mental health too, but also consider physical appearance.
Yes.
Not only like to continue to seem desirable for the people that she surrounds herself
Yeah.
with, but also on the outside end while she's with Bobby, trying to keep up that appearance and thinking that if that appearance is altered, that she might be weakened in some state. Yeah, an eating disorder might come out of that.
And again, it's such a storm of all these different elements that end up leaving Laura feeling like she is a shadow of her former self.
Yep.
I originally wrote it almost like an imposter syndrome, but it's not really that. Mm-hmm. But it's that feeling that she looks at the self in the mirror and she doesn't really connect to that person. Or at least she doesn't connect to the person that used to have those sort of childlike dreams. She views herself now as an imposter, ruining the dreams of a young girl.
It just kind of harkens to the overall image of looking in the reflection and not seeing yourself.
Yeah.
Definitely looks back to the doppelganger in the mirror for Agent Cooper. Who's to say that there isn't a little bit of that with Laura Palmer? Maybe not necessarily Bob, but definitely a bit of herself.
And another one of those elements of recontextualization, there's that famous shot we always see of her like as the homecoming queen, right? Like in the glass case at the school.
Yep.
And when she's actually decided to be homecoming queen, she views it as a mockery. She is announced as the homecoming queen, and in her mind, she's like, how can these people not know the pain I'm going through and the story behind my smile that I wear in this photo? She talks about how in the photo where she's smiling for homecoming queen, she could still feel the hands and mouths of the men she'd been with hours before. Mm-hmm. That implicit within that photo, that again, we always see these photos of Laura Palmer at the end of the episode. We always see these photos of Laura, but only she and the diary and maybe moments of Jacoby, maybe moments of Harold. But otherwise, no one knows why that smile exists and what it's hiding.
Honestly, it definitely puts up a new context when it comes to returning to Twin Peaks the first couple seasons and seeing that picture with the context of the journal in mind.
Again, I would not recommend this being someone's first Twin Peaks exposure, but I do find it fascinating to think about how someone would feel about Twin Peaks if they read the diary first and then started the show.
Yeah,
how drastically different of a take that would give someone.
So who's the next person that you're going to pull into a podcast, Kalil?
We'll see who I can wrap into it next. We'll see. So the last thing I have in my notes here is the overall purpose of the journal itself.
Yeah.
Why a journal? What does it do for Laura herself? Why keep this for 2 years and have 2 different ones?
Now, I don't recall when the second diary sort of came up. I'm mainly going off of memory onto this. But if I were to assume, I mean, Bob did kind of come in and, or some entity or something came in and sort of pushed her trust in how the diary could kind of be found and looked through and so on. So having like a secondary diary, not only to sort of hide the aspects of herself with sort of like that faux journal, just kind of like keeping it out and about so that no one would try to do the same thing or would just get the part of Laura Palmer that she wants to present to people, I would imagine to be important to her. I think that anxiety and fear is the reason why she feels the need for 2 journals.
I do think it also helps explain why this journal is so consistently negative, because the small, little, tiny positives are going to be in the other journal.
Yeah.
So
excited
there were
to see Jay
moments.
tonight.
There were moments of light and levity in her life. They are definitely not the majority.
Just mainly not here. There's some points
but there
that
are
notable.
moments in this other journal.
Yeah.
Again, it's that iceberg image, right? You have that little bit at the top and then a giant amount underwater.
Yep.
Any other thoughts, Professor, on the purpose of these journals?
I mean, the purpose of the journals is that this is the only real method we see with her delving into her emotions. Now, mind you, we do see the areas in which a rut can be made or circle can be made, but this journal was very important to her. When she was given to a gift, she promised that she would be writing into it. And though she does drop away from it, it still is that little sense of childlike comfort that she can dedicate herself into, I would say. It's the last remaining thing of Laura Palmer for Laura Palmer by Laura Palmer.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining me for this short episode of the Twin Peaks Wonderful and Strange Logcast.
Short, yep. Short. Quotation marks followed by italics, followed by bold, followed by a thought change to wingdings.
Listener, singular listener, who has stood around long enough.
Give us more credit. For any listener or listeners still around, thank you so much for joining us on this venture through Laura Palmer's diary. If you ever get a chance, if you have not read it yourself, there are plenty of points in which we have left out, and if you feel that you would be emotionally able to, you can find it available. And likely, I don't know if
anywhere
it's a local...
books are sold near you, except for probably some other places that it's old. And
that's what I'm getting at. It's like, can we find it in any place books sold? Regardless, there are areas such as Audible that's available if you want to listen to the fantastic rendition read by Cheryl Lee.
As well as many online booksellers.
Wherever you want to point in direction, where you want to support.
If you go into the woods and you ask around enough, I'm sure someone will give you a copy.
Do not do that.
Do not actually do that.
Don't go for Kalil's jokes. Like, these are things not to be trusted.
That's fair. Hey, speaking of not to be trusted, I have a wonderful and strange question of the week for you.
Okay, I look forward to the strange question. I think wonderful is very subjective after this book.
Since we are going to be watching and discussing Fire Walk with Me next, which you do know also focuses largely on Laura Palmer's life prior to the events of the series. What are you most looking forward to Fire Walk with Me showing you about Laura?
Kalil, I think we've been over this. Like, I'm on a train ride. I'm not, like, excited for my destination.
Now
I
that
just
you've
live on
heard
this
Laura's
train.
words of the diary, is there anything you're hoping or interested to see?
I mean, probably the outside of the direct bias that we do have through Laura Palmer, but I think that's more of an expectation more than it is something I hope for.
Okay,
if it breaks that mold, I'm fine with that too.
Are there any other expectations?
My other expectations? We're going to get more Leland content, and there's probably going to be elements that sort of peek through that, unfortunately, we probably can't go deeper into. There's probably going to be thematics with fire. And
what if there's no fire?
There's no fire whatsoever.
Never even brought up at all.
And there's going to be relationships and instances that I'm going to look at and get very, very sad about.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope you join us for our next episode, talking about Fire Walk with Me. After that, we'll be dipping our toes into the missing pieces of Fire Walk with Me, a separate episode. And then after that, we'll keep you posted. We'll send an owl in the air with a message that's been tied up in twine and written in the professor's blood.
No, we're put it on Twitter.
Well,
Steak
also,
Out Dreams 1.
That is Twitter. That's the same thing.
The numeral 1.
I used a euphemism for Twitter. Professor, any last words for the podcast before we do our musical ending cue? On the spot, on the spot, on the spot.
Fire, give me strength.
Hallelujah.